Ready, Nate? Thumbs up. Okay.
All right, great. So I'm going to gavel this meeting of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. I'm Kenzie Bach, the counselor from District 8 and the chair of the committee. I'll, in a second, read the list of colleagues who have joined me today. I just want to note that this public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, Verizon Channel 1964. The budget review encompasses about 27 hearings over six weeks. And we do encourage residents to engage in this process by giving testimony for the record. I want to note a number of people are in the Zoom waiting room right now to testify on this hearing. And so I just want to confirm what you should have heard by email, which is, given that this hearing started late, in this case, we will be hearing from the BPS team, and then we will pause to take public testimony before counselor questions. So anybody who's planning to testify, obviously you can follow this on the live stream, and then you'll be admitted to the Zoom chat room when it's time to testify. I just remind everybody to keep your remarks to 2 to 3 minutes, identify yourself at the beginning, and when you're joining the Zoom, make sure that you use your full name so that we know how to identify you. Otherwise, you can also testify by emailing ccc.wm, and you can, ccc.wm@boston.gov. You can also go to our City Council budget process website, which is boston.gov/council-FY21Budget, to read about how to testify, to enter a video recording of yourself, to send us written testimony that way. And I'll note that we also have a number of video testimonies that have been submitted for today's hearing. So those will be played at the conclusion of the hearing. And we look forward to including those in the full broadcast of the hearing. With that, I'll just, and also you can tweet at #BOSBudget, BOSBudget, informally as a way to enter questions. And then on May 26th at 6 p.m., we'll be having a sort of catch-all public testimony hearing focused on the BPS budget. So we also look forward to hearing from people on this topic then. So today's hearing is on docket 0588 to 0590, orders for the FY21 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations for the school department and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0591 to 0592, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations, and docket 0593 to 0596, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. So those are the dockets for the full city budget. The actual focus of today's hearing will be a continuation of this morning's discussion of BPS Commitment 1 and its strategic plan, which is to eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps. But today's hearing will be focused on some specialized academic supports that are important, especially important to the council and to our district. So those are inclusion, special ed and special ed transitions, and ELL and bilingual education plan. So we're really looking forward to hearing from the administration specifically on that, on those topics. And I just want to note that my vice chair in the Ways and Means Committee, and also the chair of the Education Committee, Councilor Anissa George, had filed a hearing order for a hearing on inclusion because of COVID-19. That didn't end up happening as had been anticipated. So I'm sort of recognizing her as a co-chair of this particular budget hearing, and as my vice chair, she may take over here, chairing it towards the conclusion today. And I'll also be recognizing her second after me for questions. Now, I'd like to just say I've been joined by my colleagues, Council President Kim Janey, District 7, Councilor Lydia Edwards from District 1. I already mentioned Councilor Anissa George at large, Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, District 5, Councilor Ed Flynn, District 2, Councilor Liz Breeden, District 9, Councilor Michael Flaherty at large, Councilor Matt O'Malley, District 6, Councilor Andrea Campbell, District 4, and Councilor Michelle Wu, also at large, and Councilor Julia Mejia, also at large. So thank you to my colleagues for joining. Today we're expecting to hear from Dr. Brenda Caselius, our superintendent, the chief financial officer, of BPS, David Bloom, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, and Mary Dillman, Executive Director of the Office of Data and Accountability, and other such colleagues as necessary. So looking forward to hearing from all of them. And after we hear from BPS, we will take testimony from the public, and then we will jump to counselor questions, and we'll play the recorded videos from the public at the conclusion of this hearing. So thank you all, and Dr. Caselius, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Madam Chair and counselors, thank you again for having us to discuss the budget, and especially this particular topic that is aligned to our #1 goal in our strategic plan, closing opportunity and achievement gaps. As we discussed in the previous session, we were talking about, the historic nature of the achievement gap in Boston Public Schools and really generally across the nation, and the disparities that we see not only in education, but the disparities that impact our children, such as housing, food access, health access, and economic security. So all of those things impact the success of children, and I'm glad that we are discussing them. Today's session is particularly geared toward our English language learners and the supports that we have in place for them, as well as the supports we have for our students with disabilities. Both specific special groups have significant challenges, and that has been exacerbated by this COVID-19 crisis. And we know that there is a lot of work still yet to do. As I am in my first year of my tenure as a superintendent of Boston Public Schools, I have been learning about the historic barriers of especially our EL learners here, particularly in Boston, given its 40-year history of trying to get it right in serving the EL learners. And knowing that in 2002, Massachusetts choosing to become English-only state, and the significant setback that had in our Boston public school system to servicing and providing the right kind of supports for our EL learners. I've had the great benefit of having Dr. Eileen Delis Reyes join our team and in the interim for our EL director. She has been a steadfast leader in the community around EL, and I have charged her team for putting in our plan, our bilingual plan for the Look Act, which was passed in 2016. Surprisingly, Boston Public School had not yet completed this task of designing and crafting a vision for bilingual education and its response to the Look Act. So I'm so anxious to have Dr. Reyes' expertise in this area, along with Andrea Zayas, our Chief Academic Officer, as they begin to craft this proposal. They have shared with me that they believe that we need a full audit done on our EL programs, because they believe that there is significant challenges and barriers to our EL services in both the assignment and the enrollment system, and the way that we are serving our children in EL. Some of this is exacerbated by our DOJ agreement with the Department of Justice, and also our agreement with Meta, who implements or oversees the certain decrees and legal action that's was against the district. So there's just a lot of work to still be unpacked and done with the service for our EL learners. But because of some of those previous legal challenges, we do have a fairly significant amount of resources that go into EL. The thing that I'm certain about, and I think Dr. Reyes would agree, is how those dollars are being spent. And that is what we want to get to the bottom of. As for our special education learners, I've already shared my significant concern with the substantially separate settings that we have for our students. I am concerned that there is not a really straightforward way to do interventions for our students, even in this COVID situation, we are instituting multi-tiered systems of support across the district to intervene more regularly with students who are exhibiting learning challenges or problems with finding success, and then doing interventions in a more progressive way so that we can better learn from those interventions so that students are not over-identified. Currently, I think that students are over-identified in special education, and we need to make sure that we understand why that is happening, and then we put in place ways to address that and provide better supports for our students with disabilities. And so I've hired Tammy Poost, who is a special education lawyer. Right now, she's also helping us with our COVID response coordination. She was also administrative law judge in the state of Minnesota, and she's been a colleague of mine for many years. And she was a family advocate for special education as well. So she comes with a really strong knowledge around special education and programming and supports and systems, and especially the legal eye on what we need to be doing to better serve our children with disabilities. And so you'll see in the future a much larger focus on these two special groups of students. And that hopefully will help us get at closing the gaps for our students with disabilities, as well as our students who are English learners. I want to just give you a little bit of that background before Nate gets to the presentation, and also kind of the numbers of where things are at and how we're doing currently, and only to say that the work is still yet undone. We will not have all of the answers because we've just now initiated all of this thinking and work that as the new superintendent, and as I better understand the historical lens of our efforts so far and where we need to go in the future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Cooter to go ahead and give the presentation, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Superintendent. And thank you, Councilor Bach, and members of the City Council, members of the community who are with us today, and the BPS community at large. Thank you again for inviting us back. I will attempt to streamline the talking points here, just because I know you'll have many questions as they came out in the hearing this morning, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity, of course, to mention once again, it is Teacher Appreciation Week this week. And I just want to take a moment to shout out the second grade teacher. You can see I have a theme here. Second grade teacher at the Pt.2 school, Jasmine Acevedo. You know, one side effect of being home with my kids and hearing their online learning is that I get to see firsthand really the interactions that are happening between them and their teachers. And I can say, having watched over the last couple of weeks, snuck into some of the Zoom classes, watching Miss Acevedo teach reading is like seeing Hamilton live. It's technically amazing. It is fun to watch, and the kids absolutely love it. And I think there are many teachers out there who are doing amazing things online, going above and beyond to really engage their students and teach during this setting. And I want to take a moment to just appreciate all of them throughout the district. Today, as we mentioned, the topic of is going to be the achievement gaps with a specific focus on special education and English learners. We did want to start off by highlighting, as the fourth of 8 hearings on our $1.26 billion budget. You heard me say this morning, but it bears repeating. The first is that we've received an unprecedented investment in FY21 and a commitment to sustain this investment going forward. At a time when we have a lot of uncertainty, this commitment to FY21 is helping us build our plan going forward. The second thing I want to note is the district and the city is responding to immediate disruption of COVID-19. And we're evaluating both our FY21 budget and our FY20 budget effort to really create flexibility to respond. Many of the questions this morning about summer learning, what we're doing is really trying to understand what resources are available that we can use for this summer. And then having said that, the third thing I just want to start off by saying is we really believe that the FY21 budget priorities that we established are just as relevant today as they were 2 months ago. That we had already aligned our budget to support our highest needs students and to invest in the transformation of our lowest performing schools. And this is our promise to raise quality throughout the city but also be in a position to support students when we return to school in person, and to be able to catch them up on unfortunately, a lot of the learning that has been lost. Appropriately for the achievement gap, and really the grounding statement for our budget process this year has been in this collective call to action and urgency around closing achievement gaps. You've heard me talk about the level of investment, the $36 million that's going to new services in teachers, students, and content, really trying to affect the instructional core, increasing the knowledge and skill of teachers, changing the content, and altering the relationship of the student to the content and the teachers. And one of the things the academic team has been really focused on and has been emphasizing across the board is that the content needs to be the content across all subject areas. And then it needs to be rigorous content in our English learner classes. It needs to be rigorous content in our special education classes. And that's really what they're driving at in terms of raising the bar for all of our students. The $80 million investment, you've seen this before. For anyone who's tuning in for the first time, this is our breakdown of the $80 million increase, showing $36 million in new investments and $44 million in cost increases. The strategic plan has been the anchoring point for the hearings going forward. I covered this morning, so I'll be brief here. On commitment 1, which is the topic for today, you see 11 priorities underneath that commitment. We covered 9 of the 11 priorities this morning, and what we're focused on here today is the remaining 2, the English Learner Support and Look Act, which is the 4th priority, and then the 10th priority, which is special education student needs, particularly talking about inclusion and the need for us to address disproportionate referral, as the superintendent said in her opening remarks. We're going to start first, of course, with priority number 4, which is support for English learners by implementing the Look Act and expanding programs. Across the English Learners Department, there are a number of services in the way that they're organized. It includes the Newcomers Assessment Center, which we had questions about this morning, and really understanding what are the language needs of students when they arrive to our district. Designing and working with the academics team to build rigorous academic programming, community engagement, translation, interpretation, and then of course equity and accountability. There really are internal watchdogs for programs working with us to understand and ensure that budgets are built with the special needs of English learners in mind. This slide highlights the diversity of our district. Over 44% of our students are English learners or formerly English learners, which is the FEL. Those are students who at one point had an English learner development level. We'll refer to ELD levels as sort of their progression in learning academic English. You can see that 44% of our district at one time was an English learner. Of our current English learners, 57% are in our lowest ELD levels. That's 1 through 3. Those are students who are really new to learning English across the domains. And then we have an incredibly rich and diverse city. Over 70 plus languages are represented in our English learners. Here you can see the chart showing the highest incident languages, most notably Spanish, and the superintendent previewed this morning, and we'll talk more about our plans to roll out dual language in Cape Verdean, and we already have a dual language program in Haitian Creole. We're also addressing and looking into Vietnamese as sort of our high incidence languages. The initiatives for FY21 and really the base of the English learner department's work is in curriculum and lesson planning support. You can see some of the named initiatives that they're working on this year. Dual language program expansion and support. The Look Act offers us a lot more flexibility to think about how we're serving English learners, helping them to learn English, while also maintaining their cultural heritage and respecting their cultural and linguistic assets. And so we're looking at expanding dual language both to improve across the board and offer that across the board to more languages. We're also looking at expansion and continuously evaluating our translation and interpretation services, as Councilor Mejia was asking us about this morning, and then supplemental services for being able to provide partnership support for English learners, and thinking about after school and summer school opportunities, remote learning opportunities for our English learners. We have English learner programs across many of our 123 schools, and they can be thought of in 6 main categories. SEI refers to our sheltered English immersion programs. We have both language specific, so you'll see an SEI Spanish program, or multilingual for low incidence languages. We also have dual language, and there are multiple models in our district for dual language. We're looking to explore that more. We often talk about our students with limited or interrupted formal education. Those are students who have had disruption, obviously, in their language. Many students coming from countries that may have had natural disasters or may not have formal education set up will come here, and there's a specialized program for those students. ESL, and then English ELA embedded with ESL supports for students is how we think of supporting our students who are in the general education setting, either 4s and 5s or English learners who have not chosen to enroll in an SEI program. Overall, our budget for English learners includes $111 million. This covers English learners budget covers a number of different categories. The first is the Department of English Language Learners, which is the central office that supports our efforts. It also includes all of the teachers and paraprofessionals that are coded as bilingual in our budget. And then finally, all programs that go to support either bilingual or SEI programs. And that includes translations that may be a contracts line, but is really dedicated towards those supports. And so what you see is an increase 40.9 FTE overall. EL paraprofessionals FTE are increasing by 12.7, and there's also a $400K investment for the development of curriculum and professional supports for teachers for the development of new dual language programs for FY21. We wanted to highlight our investment around family liaisons here in the English learner hearing, because this is really targeted towards our schools that are serving high incidence, schools with a lot of families who speak languages other than English. And so our goal is to develop these positions so that they're trusted members of the community and connect and support families to resources both inside and outside BPS. But they also have ensuring that we have families have access to somebody in the school who has cultural and linguistic capabilities, who represents the community they're serving. And so as part of this family liaison hiring, we're really looking for language diversity. It's a job requirement in many of the schools that are hiring them. And these allocations were given not only to schools that were identified as transformation schools, as I mentioned in the hearing this morning, but it also went to schools where over 50% of their school community speaks a language other than English, a single language other than English. And so you'll see family liaisons rolled out in East Boston for Spanish-speaking schools with a lot of Spanish-speaking families, and at the Quincy as a school that has a lot of Chinese-speaking families. Wanted to highlight here, we did an equity analysis that I presented at the first hearing and during school committee, where we looked at the dollars per pupil and which students they benefit. Obviously, some specific investments are targeted towards English learners, like dual language programs, but there are also the way that we allocate resources, which schools get additional resources, and then how we allocate other things that are not explicitly English learner resources or coded as English language resources, but really are targeting those populations like the family liaisons. What we find is that English learners benefited from the FY21 investments at a higher per pupil rate than any other subgroup in the district. The average investment was $700 per pupil for FY21. The average for English learners was $853. This shows that through explicit and other ways, we are investing in our English learners for FY21 to continue to close achievement gaps and support those students. And we've gotten multiple questions on translation. This is the information I referenced a little bit this morning, but shows the amount and volume of translation and interpretation services. 17,500 requests since July 1st of 2019 through this year. So you can see a high volume, 48 parent preferred languages that parents are asking to be communicated in. We are getting this out so that schools know that they can request both interpretation and translation services. And you can see the different types. I'm sure you'll have more questions about that. I will also say that we are committed to translating all of these presentations and posting them online by next week so that we will, as a finance team, start to model the need to translate, or I should say try and catch up to the model that the English learner team has demonstrated in terms of the need to translate and make sure our resources are accessible to all of our families. Touching upon priority 10 under this first commitment is to develop and monitor progress towards achieving explicit goals for students with disabilities. And so we're talking a lot as a district around building inclusive practices. This has been something that the superintendent has emphasized really since day one of arriving in Boston. And it's something that we have worked on as a district, and I think we need to have a renewed sense of urgency towards. Here you can see, as I highlighted for the Office of English Learners, that the Office of Special Education has 5 different teams within it, thinking about identifying and placing students, understanding and testing what the students' needs are, doing instructional and support practices, helping provide technical assistance to teachers in different inclusion settings, from general education to substantially separate, student, family, and community engagement, equity and accountability, the same as English learners, and transition services, helping students as they transition out of BPS and into the workforce to make sure that they have the supports they need and the skills that they need to be able to be successful. Similar to the slide on the demographics for English learners, here's a breakdown of our special education students or students with disabilities across different groups. And you can see we've highlighted 5 different settings, those students who are in out-of-district special education programs. Those are specialized programs for our highest need students. Public day includes our Horace Mann School for the Deaf, or the McKinley Schools for students with emotional impairment. We also have substantially separate programs, as the superintendent referenced, partial inclusion, and then full inclusion model. This is the breakdown by group, so you'll see it by ethnicity, by gender, and then overall numbers are all the way on the left. Our FY21 budget represents a $24.4 million increase in special education spending. We're looking across both the special education department and our special education contracted services. Those are the costs of our out-of-district placements and contracted services for providers who come in and provide some of our related services. It also includes all of our special education accounts, special education teachers, mostly, and special education aides. It also includes positions like our ABA support team. This also includes anything that's tagged to a special education program code. So if we're using contracts to support special education students, it's all included in this $324 million budget number that's over and above the amount of money that we spend on every student through our general education programs. And then, as I did in the highlighting for the English learners, I'm going to highlight for special education that while English learners were the subgroup that had the highest per pupil investment, the next group are students with disabilities. And so the investments that we're making do have an above average investment in students with disabilities. Again, showing that we're continuing to invest in our highest need students as a priority for the FY21 budget. This shows the detailed breakdown. As I mentioned in the earlier hearing, bostonpublicschools.org/explore budgets. You can really see in detail how each of our programs are supported and break down for different demographic groups. I think it was Councilor Arroyo who first brought this up this morning, but I imagine the topic of conversation today will be about the overlap between these two groups. Obviously, you can't separate needs of students. We have approximately 20% of our students are identified as both students with disabilities and students who are ELs. And so it's important for us to build cohesion across all academic strategies to ensure that we're serving all of our students well. And so 64% of our English learners with disabilities speak Spanish as a first language. It shows we need to build our language capacity in our programs as well. And we're looking at being able to, when we roll out dual language at schools, be able to provide those opportunities for our English learners who are in the special ed programs as well. This shows further breakdown. We wanted to make sure that we are reporting all of our students. Of course, this is almost necessarily a simplified version. We are required to be reporting students with one primary disability. We know that there may be multiple issues that a student is dealing with or disabilities that we may be including in their IEP, but this is their primary and secondary, our primary disability. And so you'll see the breakdown both across disability groups and what we refer to as high incidence or low incidence, based on the number of students you can see in our district overall, and then broken down by race and ethnicity, so that you can see English learners and then by language group, so you can really start to understand who our English learners are and what the breakdown is by program type, and sort of start to think about how we're designing and laying out our footprint to be able to service these students. Between 2015 and 2019, the graduation rate for students with disabilities has increased by 2.5%. The growth is on pace with the overall district increase in graduation rate from 2015. The percentage of students with disabilities dropping out has decreased 4 percentage points, and the rate of students remaining enrolled after 4 years additionally has increased 2.5%. So what we're looking at is we are retaining more students, meaning keeping them enrolled in the district, continuing to provide services, while also raising the rigor and expectations to make sure they're graduating on time. And this is part of our work and our challenges to make sure that we are really working to keep all students on track to graduate and be prepared for post-secondary success. With that, I'll just highlight again our resources that are available online for you to go and explore yourself, and the schedule of events for you to come back and tune in for the entire series here with City Council and the Boston Public Schools. With that, I'll turn it back over to Chairman Bach.
Great, thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate that. And I'm gonna make one exception to our run order. Councilor Lydia Edwards deferred most of her questions from this morning to this afternoon, and also has to leave by 3 o'clock. So because I know we've got a number of people waiting to testify from the public, I'm gonna let her ask her questions and ask the administration to answer them. And then we will go to public testimony. And I just wanna note for colleagues that I know it's out of order, but I really appreciated Councilor Edwards' close attention to the time this morning. And I don't want it to be in vain that she waited for this afternoon. So Councilor Edwards, you have the floor.
Thank you. It sounds like I got a check plus from Chairwoman Bach. I wanted to just reiterate what I said before, representing one of the larger ESL populations, and ELL populations, and also representing students that have special needs. Especially mothers reached out to me, and I am frightened. I am deeply concerned about the loss and learning of those children now that school has been formally canceled, and how we're going to get back on track. But for many people, the track was still shaky when we were going, but and I appreciate the budget addressing some of those gaps. But one, what's your plan for that particular population, special needs, EL students, period? Number two, I wanted to make sure that we were focused in terms of dollars, and where have the increases been in the budget specifically to deal with pandemic and EL services and special needs services. I know we touched on briefly the fact that inclusion students have different choices or limited choices in terms of their schools. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is the if you were applying for an exam school, I believe you get an email or some sort of correspondence back from BPS that's only in English. And so their back and forth or the application of the next step is not for all languages. And then finally, with you had mentioned before that there was so much concentration, and I appreciate this, on a lot of the students and the restructuring of schools going forward and making sure that they're highlighted. But in terms of funding for ELL schools, not only is there a pandemic, but could you touch on the increases specifically and accounting for them as we're changing the structures of the schools? So the K to 6s, the 7 to 12s, where they fit in that.
So one of the things that we're doing to create flexibility going into FY21 is we have put a hold on much of the spending that we had planned for this spring at both the central and school level. And so that originally arose out of the need to sort of stop deliveries because we couldn't get physical goods, and now is more, sort of become part of our strategy for how do we carry in flexibility for next year. We're also, of course, evaluating federal stimulus dollars. The CARES Act provided additional resources, but as the superintendent noted, and it bears repeating multiple times, the state has a waiver that allows them to reduce state funding in the amount that we receive in federal CARES Act funding. So there's still the potential that we may see a reduction in state aid equal to the amount we got. And so we are still trying to cost out what summer learning could look like, but we're also working very closely with the city budget office to really understand what additional resources we'll have from either the federal government or the state government. And of course, the state is dealing with significant loss in revenues going into next year, but the city is committed to really maintaining our budget. So that's part of the flexibility you'll see. And you won't see it necessarily in a line item in FY21, but it's really trying to carry money forward in ways that we can and try and create that flexibility through the CARES Act. So I just wanted to start with that. I think the other piece that you mentioned that I think is really important around the K to 6 expansion. One of the things that we've done for schools that are expanding to K to 6, and we know that anytime we change the configuration of school, it's disruptive in two ways. One, for the school adding the new grade or the new program, they're often asked to start it before enrollment really supports the full program of it. The second thing is those 6th grades are being added at the expense of our other schools. So when we expand 6th grade at the Harvard Kent in Charlestown, there's going to be a decline in enrollment at the Edwards in Charlestown. And so we've committed in FY21 to support both schools. And in a lot of ways, we're sort of creating double capacity as we transition to make sure that students who are both at the schools that are adding and students who are at the schools that are losing are not harmed because we have a enrollment-based funding system. And so this is one of the ways that we've sort of moved away from a pure enrollment-based system to make sure students are appropriately supported. In East Boston, of course, as you mentioned, high percentage of English learners, a lot of Spanish-speaking families, and so that is an investment in supporting those families, and is in some ways supporting the English language programs that are there. I'll stop there. I don't know if I got to all of the parts of your question. It looks like Brenda wants to join in.
The testing, I think, is most important for me in assessing where these kids are going in order where they are and figuring out how much learning has been lost and how vulnerable they are before we start next year. I don't know how we're going to do that.
Yeah.
You're on mute. Sorry.
Our annual testing cycle for English learners obviously has been significantly disrupted. And one of the complications is because we're under the consent decree, we have a number of parties we need to negotiate with when we're making any changes to our regular practice. So we are working with the state and with the Department of Justice, consulting with a number of other experts in the field to try and put together a plan where we're going to adjust our assessment of English learners and English language capacity. We're able to start doing it again. and we hope to have an update on that soon.
I can speak to the instructional pieces, David, and I think I was asked, Counselor was asking specifically about assessment. We do have the winter results from the access tests. So once we're able to give tests again in person, we'll be able to compare those and see where the gaps are, and then we'll be able to program for the students. So that's a really important piece. The other is that they will still be taking any of the interim assessments that we're going to do based on the standards for our students during this summer, during this remote learning time, and then have the opportunity to take summer learning as well. So we'll be identifying students who need help. We'll be continuing our translation services. Right now, we have teachers who are accessing our OEL office and translation services to translate the remote learning materials. We have a website with academic links to multilingual supports for our teachers. So our academic office is supporting all of that, as well as our OEL office. So that work is ongoing, and we're getting better and stronger at that every day. So that's the piece. And then in the future, in terms of thinking, you know, how do we better support our EL students all along? I mentioned in my original comments that Dr. Reyes has said it's just really, really important for us to do an audit of our programming and the assignment pieces of that, and the registration and how that's happening, and how we're assigning students to levels 1, 2, and 3, and what types of support, whether it's sheltered instruction, whether it's dual language, whether it's some other type of strategy that we want to use to better serve our students. And so I'm anxious for that to happen. And then just finally, I'll say we did put in family liaisons to do the third piece that Dr. De Los Reyes said was so important, which is the wraparound services for families and supporting the family, as well as supporting the child in their academic development and their social emotional well-being. So we have those family liaisons based in schools that are over 50% one language. So I think a lot of East Boston schools actually did end up getting a family liaison for that reason. David, do you know how many of those were? Maybe you can come back to it.
Unmuted, sorry. Yes, so yeah, I'll be ready with that in a second.
All right.
I respect that I got to jump the line, Chairwoman Bach. So if there's any follow-up or any other questions, I will submit them in writing.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. I really appreciate that. And yeah, David, if we can get that number to her and then follow up on further questions. Thanks. Okay, we're now going to move to public testimony. What will happen for those of you who are watching and are also in the waiting room, so I'll be admitting people sort of 3 at a time into the main Zoom. It's important that when you're admitted, you turn off, silence, etc., the live stream, because otherwise we get a bad echo when you're speaking. And again, I just ask people to introduce themselves and keep their comments brief to 2 to 3 minutes, just because we have a number of people waiting, and then we've also got a number of counselors who are eager to ask questions on these topics. So with that, I am admitting, first will be Jessica Tang, president of the BTU, and then Emma Fialka-Feldman, and then Mary Claire Flores, and then Eileen Carver. So I'm going to admit all 4 of you, but I will call on you in that order based on your testimony signups. Great. And now if you can, Jessica, if you could silence the live stream, that would be great. All right. Now recognizing Jessica Tang, BTU president.
Apologies, I didn't realize I was in already. Good afternoon, counselors. So my name is Jessica Tang, and I am very proud to serve as the BTU president, representing 10,000 in service and retired educators in Boston Public Schools. And I do want to give a special thank you to all of them during Teacher Appreciation Week and National Teacher Appreciation Day for their incredible dedication and hard work during this unprecedented crisis. Now, in Boston, we believe in inclusion done right, and this has been a priority issue for several years now. Inclusion done right means having district and school-based leadership with a vision that embraces inclusion and backs that vision up with the resources that are needed to make it work. It means recognizing that a teacher with multiple certifications is not able to provide excellent instruction for every student and at the same time meet the IEP requirements for students with significant special needs, as well as our English language learners who also require special accommodations as well. It includes also ensuring meaningful professional development for educators tailored to the needs in their school communities. And several Boston public schools have implemented successful inclusion programs, and we applaud them. And we also know from their success what it takes. We need to learn from what's working and provide equitable opportunities for all, including access to high-quality programs for students. Inclusion done right can't just be for a small number of students at a handful of our schools. We need to make it work citywide to ensure that all students have the assistance they need. The Henderson Inclusion School in Boston is an excellent example of inclusion done right. At the Henderson, each classroom has 2 teachers who work with additional staff, including paraprofessionals, therapists, and related service providers, who work together to ensure each student has the individualized support and attention they need to participate, learn, and succeed. In a Henderson classroom, you'll find students with disabilities learning alongside their non-disabled peers. During a math lesson, most of the class might be working independently on fractions, while paraprofessionals helping one student with basic addition and a special education teacher is providing inclusive accommodations for another small group of students. This is what it means to create a healthy learning environment for all students. Our BPS BTU inclusion work group was collaborating on recommendations for what inclusion done right means for BPS, and we were extremely close to getting an agreement completed. Unfortunately, the work of that group and our negotiations were cut short because of the pandemic. However, figuring this out continues to be an urgent matter, along with making sure that the necessary funding continues to be available, not just to maintain what we knew was already insufficient, but to actually make real improvements. Now, during the pandemic, students with significant special needs are having a harder time than ever getting their educational needs met. When we return to school, it is imperative, when we return to school buildings, it is imperative that all inclusion students be able to learn in classrooms with the appropriate support system so they can reach their highest potential, especially after this time of enormous challenges. The recent DESE BPS review found that special ed services in the district are in systemic, quote unquote, in systemic disarray, and don't provide appropriate learning opportunities for many students in the least restrictive environment. Related findings include the district has not defined a consistent inclusion policy that delineates staffing and recommends models of inclusive instruction. A disproportionate number of students are assigned to separate classrooms, and there's an over-focus by the BPS Office of Special Ed on compliance, as described by several BPS leaders. We are anxious to address the issues that prolonged segregation has assigned many students to inclusion programs where their rights to first-class education are being denied. And successes at schools such as Henderson can and need to serve as models for other schools. And we're looking forward to working with BPS on these continued efforts. Today, you'll hear from educators and parents who are fighting for inclusionary classrooms, and also we are calling on members of this council to support our efforts, including this assurance that funding from the Student Opportunity Act are not postponed or diminished, and to make inclusion a reality in our classrooms. We are concerned by recent pushes to delay and also decrease funding from the Student Opportunities Act, but how the CARET Act also may be impacted as well. We are here to reiterate our commitment to work with BPS to lead the district toward increased inclusion opportunities that have the appropriate resources for student success. And we hope you will join us in calling for adequate funding, not austerity, not only in the city, but also at the State House and federally to meet the needs of our most vulnerable students. We have already seen what inclusion done right can look like, and now is not the time to regress. Our students need it now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. And next we'll be moving to Emma Fialka-Feldman, and then it'll be Mary Claire Flores. Folks, once you finish testifying, feel free to leave the Zoom and go back watching on the screen. I'll just note, I am going to set, just because I know we've got a bunch of people, I am going to set an alarm that'll go off so you'll hear if your time has elapsed. And again, just asking people to keep these to 2 to 3 minutes. So thank you again, Jessica. Now recognizing Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma Fialka-Feldman, a resident of Boston, and a proud BPS elementary teacher, eager to go back to my virtual classroom at 4. Boston has not always been my home. When I was looking for graduate programs to study elementary education, I learned about the Henderson Inclusion School. I moved to Boston in part because of the work of a handful of BPS schools to support inclusion done right. They were showing what the national research supports, that when students with and without disabilities learn together, all students achieve at high levels. We raise the bar for what we imagine is possible. In these BPS schools, students with significant support needs learn alongside their gen ed peers with the right supports. At times, this means 2 full-time teachers and a paraprofessional, or it can mean multiple adults used strategically throughout the day. I have worked in BPS for over 7 years, and I stay because I believe we must continue to fight for inclusion done right. It's not simply about how much money we spend, it's about how we spend this money. I have watched students and families counseled out of inclusion placements, not because their child doesn't belong in inclusion, but because we don't have the services in their neighborhood school to meet their needs. This has been particularly true for students of color in our district. I have worked tirelessly and not always successfully to meet the needs of all my students with and without disabilities because I'm triple certified in elementary education, special education, and English language learners. And I'm supposed to do the job of 3 humans as 1 human. I have watched families leave our district because bold inclusive options exist in neighboring school districts. I will continue to stay in BPS because I believe that the school district and city will support this essential and innovative work. It wasn't too long ago that students with disabilities were denied the opportunity to attend school, let alone a neighborhood school. When we fail to make inclusion done right, we send our students, families, and schools back to those dark times of low expectations and segregation. I hope together with more funding, strong leadership, and a deep commitment to inclusion done right, BPS will demonstrate that inclusion isn't just for some kids in certain schools, it's the expectation for all kids all across the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And next up is Mary Claire. And I'll just say, I'm going to admit some other members of the public to the thing. Just wait for me to call on you. So Mary Claire.
Hi, my name is Mary Claire Flores. I am a 5th grade inclusion teacher at the Hennigan K-8 school. I have students with disabilities in my class and have students that have, disabilities in my class that have individualized education plans, as well as students in my class that do not have any disabilities. This is what we call inclusion, but it's not the way it's supposed to be. We know that general ed students and students with disabilities learn best when they are together. We know this. However, it is not good enough to simply make sure that these students are in the classroom. There must be the right supports and resources and quality teaching that is allowing every student equitable access to learning. Currently, I am one teacher who works with a paraprofessional in our classroom, and I'm considered both the special education teacher and the general education teacher. As a younger teacher, I was told that to work in Boston, I needed to be as, and I wanted to be as qualified as possible, get all the certifications and licenses that you can to make sure that I was providing the most quality education to our students. However, I soon learned that it was to a disadvantage to have all of these licenses. In fact, I'm triple certified, but I didn't report my ESL license because I knew it would mean that my students would have less access to the supports that they needed if I was supposed to do the role of 3 people rather than being simply their classroom teacher. It's not feasible for me to be the special education teacher and the general education teacher at the same time. How can I provide the small group instructions that are called for in their individualized education plan and make sure that I'm differentiating and tending to the rest of the class at the same time? Yes, I have both license, but it doesn't mean that I should be doing both jobs at once. We know that successful models of inclusion have co-teaching. However, all across the district, we have varying inclusion programs that look drastically differently. Some schools have co-teachers attending to the needs of all the classrooms. Some people have paraprofessionals that follow the students. Some have paraprofessionals, but they don't follow the students to specialists. And then this teacher is all alone attending to the needs of that class without any assistance. We need more teachers and support staff, not more licenses. A license cannot pull a small group. A license cannot stand in front of the class and lead a lesson. It's simply not the same as having 2 teachers who can provide instruction and services to meet the needs of the students in the inclusion classroom. So we as a district need to stop pretending that 2 licenses in a room can do the work of 2 teachers. What is perhaps most concerning is that teachers and community members have been telling the district this for years and years. And now DESE has done an analysis and has determined the same thing that we've been telling the district. The moral of the story is to listen to teachers and community members. We are having the important conversations. We're doing the work on the ground every day, and we're connected to one another, and we know what our district needs. The issue cannot wait until after COVID-19. I know it's hard, but we have to continue, especially since we know that this virus has only exacerbated the inequalities, especially for our EL students and our students with disabilities. Right now, we are not meeting their needs. We are not in compliance. And we know this because teachers are the first responders in identifying and helping connect families to food, shelter, unemployment, mental health supports, Wi-Fi, and ensuring the safety of our students. Some of the students we've had the most trouble contacting have come to class, have not been able to come to class, and they're the ones who have disabilities. It is therefore imperative that if we want to practice what the district preaches in terms of equity in schools, especially for ELs and students with disabilities, we must listen to teachers. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we definitely have most of them, and our community will be there to back it up.
Thank you, Mary Claire. Recognizing now Eileen Carver, to be followed by Zoe Fahy and then Chantel.
We'll be there to back it up.
Eileen, before you go, if you can please turn off your live stream, it's creating an echo.
Eileen Carver, to be followed by Zoe Fahy and then Chantel.
I'm not planning to testify.
Eileen, before you go, if you can please turn off your live stream, it's creating an echo. Okay, if you're not testifying, we'll move to the next person. Thanks so much.
Good.
Okay, next up is Zoe.
Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Fay. I am a co-teacher in a third grade inclusion room at the Donald McKay School in East Boston. MF Yalka Feldman was actually my mentor teacher in graduate school. I'm really fortunate right now that I work at a school that has fully adopted the two-teacher inclusion model. And because of this model, the first few years of my career in education have been full of pretty much constant reminders that students are capable of so much more than we often think they are. I have a student, for example, who began third grade this year working on sound letter identification and other pre-reading strategies. He needs a one-to-one scribe and assistive technology to write. And honestly, there were many moments this year where I doubted that full inclusion was the correct placement for him. But with school-wide support at the McKay on flexible co-teaching models, and push-in support, and honestly with just time, the student is now reading and beginning for the first time to write. No setup is perfect, but he's growing, he's happy, and he is a very valued member of our learning community. I'm not saying that full inclusion is easy or it's the simplest way, but it really is worth it. I think it's worth it to fund co-teaching, it's worth it to fund aids for specialty teachers, and it's worth it to go out of our comfort zone if we take the promise of equity seriously in this district. I think we are all capable of doing incredible things under the right conditions. We all deserve to feel true belonging in our communities, and these are the lessons that inclusive settings offer. Most importantly, these are the messages that inclusive settings send to students who are engaged in the fragile and beautiful work of growing up and building ideas about who they are and what they are capable of. Ultimately, IEPs are meant to represent a conversation between families and schools. They're meant to be a co-constructed process where we figure out what environment is going to help their children thrive. If our schools do not offer true inclusion, we are taking an option that many families want off the table and that could be the right fit to help their children. As we work to build a cohesive plan for special education, I urge you to think of the possibilities for our students in Boston and to send the right message to them and to their families. Thank you for your time, and thank you to my amazing colleagues and the wonderful families that we partner with for testifying today.
Great, thank you so much, Zoe. Next up is Shantae Alves. Sorry, I got that wrong the first time around. And then after that, it'll be Jeanette Mihari. So.
No problem, thank you. Good afternoon, members of the City Council. My name is Shantae Alves, and I am a sixth-year Boston early childhood inclusion educator. I am here today to advocate for adequate training for stakeholders and consistent support and funding for our students with special needs. In a very public recently released report, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education notes that in the Boston Public Schools District, special education services are in systemic disarray. They do not provide appropriate learning opportunities in the least restrictive environment for all students with disabilities, and it contributes to a pattern of inequitable access to learning opportunities. It goes on to say that while there are some examples of effective inclusive practice in the district has not defined or implemented a consistent inclusion policy that delineates staffing and recommended models of inclusive instruction. Some examples this report alludes to are the handful of schools being funded to have a more equitable model, with inclusion classrooms that are staffed with more than one teacher who provides instruction and required services. Yet a handful of schools out of over 120 seems highly exclusive and, dare I say, intentionally exclusive. I am here to ask for support in the call for more funding for our schools. One educator with multiple licenses and maybe a learning specialist who supports multiple grade levels is not enough for our students with special needs, nor our general education students. Dual or triple licensure does not make up for quality small group instruction. We need to stop failing our children and families and ensure all children in Boston Public Schools have the equitable and excellent educational experiences they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now next up, Jeanette, I'm sorry, I've forgotten if it's a hard or soft G. So
it's a hard G, but thank you. Jeanette. I appreciate it. Well, thank you, Chairman Bach and members of the council for the chance to testify today. I'm a proud science teacher at the Curley K-8 school and a Boston resident. I teach 24 classes a week. 20 of them I teach alone, and 8 of those classes are inclusion classes. My students come from homerooms where they have 3 adults in the classroom. About 6 years ago, our school rolled out inclusion. We've had many successes, but one gap we continue to have is the lack of staffing support in inclusion classrooms. Our inclusion team includes our art teachers, like physical education, dance, music, Spanish teachers. And I'm here because I want our district to incorporate a model for staffing inclusion that includes another person in specialty classrooms like my science classroom. My science classroom is material heavy, highly active, and inquiry based. We plant, we have a variety of animals in the classroom, we do weekly experiments, and we journal. As I look back at my years of teaching, it's clear to me that I'm a better teacher to all my students, including those who receive special education supports, when I am with another adult, when I'm teaching with another adult. In the times that I've had another adult in my classroom, students got support physically accessing experiments, scribing, using technology, and got to spend more time outside. It's a better and richer experience for all my students. The same is echoed by my entire specialist team. It's tempting for me to focus my support on science because so many of my students' IEPs include science. But I believe that my students deserve to build their identities as athletes and dancers, artists, and scientists. The truth is, when we fail to provide the right supports, we deny our students the opportunity to become all that they can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up is Alana. After Alana, it's going to be Mayu, and then Renee and Annabelle. I would just ask, there's one person who's waiting in the chat who's just got a number. If you could change your display name, we just ask people to put a name in before we admit them. So thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to all that are on this call. My name's Elena Haynes, and I am co-chair of the Family Council at the Phineas Bates Elementary School in Rosendale. As an inclusion school, the Bates serves children who receive a range of special education services and general education students in every classroom in grades K0 through 5. Currently, there are 2 classrooms on each grade level, each with their own homeroom teacher. At each grade level, we also have 1 special education teacher serving as an inclusion specialist, as well as a paraprofessional. This ensures that classroom teachers are supported by special education teachers for half of the school day and have the support of a paraprofessional for the other half of the school day. The model works well much of the day of the school. The model works well much of the time, although it came about after our original model, 1 para for each classroom full-time, plus the alternating inclusion specialist, had to be adjusted due to budget cuts. The teachers at the base are working hard to make our two-adult model successful, and teachers are able to do significantly more small group instruction because they are not the only adult in the classroom. Even with the success of this model, there are significant challenges. IEP meetings and testing frequently pull teachers away from classrooms, and due to scheduling constraints, our specialist teachers generally lead their classes without additional staffing support. This not only makes it challenging to provide meaningful, differentiated instruction, but can create safety issues. What happens to a single teacher conducting a lesson outside on the schoolyard or in the outdoor classroom when a child has a crisis? A single educator cannot do therapeutic crisis intervention with one child and simultaneously keep the other children safe. At the Bates, we are lucky enough to have a crisis team in place with a full-time BCBA and social worker. These staff are able to help once they travel to the location of the crisis, provided they are not already supporting another student. With 260 students, this is frequently the case. If this is a challenge at our school, where we already have more staff than many others, we know it must be enormously challenging for schools with even fewer inclusion support staff. Our schools need adequate staffing to address the realities of supporting students' academic and social emotional needs. This work cannot be done by single teachers with multiple licenses.
Great.
My other co-chair, Nora, should be finishing off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, Nora is with us. And actually, so it's Renee next, and then it will be, or Nora, why don't you go ahead, and then Renee, we'll have you after, just since your testimony is linked. Go ahead, Nora.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nora McManus-Vincent. I'm co-chair of the Phineas Bates Elementary Family Council with Elena, who just spoke. And I'll just take a moment and pick up where she left off. So beyond these basic school-wide staffing needs that Elena outlined and that others have spoken about, we believe that all students deserve physical education, arts education, and science and technology education. We know that these are often thought of as extras or enrichment, and we know how common it is for children with special needs to be offered remediation, while children labeled as gifted are offered enrichment. We worry that these important enriching opportunities will increasingly be sacrificed due to Inclusion School's commitment to staffing the inclusion model in the right way. We know that the free, appropriate public education that our students with special needs are entitled to is one that is staffed appropriately for them to be supported in accessing the curriculum and also to have access to enrichment. We know that in Boston, there's a longstanding tradition of voting to approve BPS budgets that we know are woefully inadequate because we believe there's no other option. We appeal to all of you on the City Council to please interrupt this cycle of approving budgets that we know come nowhere near providing what our students need. As our city councilors, please do everything in your power to help Boston's most vulnerable children thrive. Thank you all so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora. Next up, we'll have Renee, and then Phuong Dai Nguyen, and then Janice. And I'll just note one more time that we've got one remaining person, 134644, in the waiting room, and I do need you to change it to a name before I admit you. So Renee, please go ahead. Renee, you're muted. Okay, Renee's not testifying. So then we'll go next to Phuong Dai Nguyen. Phuong Dai, seeing none. Okay, then Janice. Janice, are you testifying? All right, if not, then I think we've reached the end of the public testimony period. We really appreciate all the educators and parents who came to speak to us today about inclusion. And with that, I want to jump to back to counselor questions. So as I alluded to from the start, I'll be recognizing Counselor Asabi George, and I'm going to defer my questions for a little while, so I'll go right to Counselor Asabi George. I also want to note that we've got 8 video testimonies that people have submitted, and we'll be playing those at the end of the hearing as a second run of public testimony, along with taking anybody else who comes to testify in the meantime. So we look forward to hearing those. And now, without further ado, I want to pass the baton to Councillor Sabi George, except that I'm going to note one more thing, which is that I have a new method around question timing, just because I want to get the maximum number in. So what I'll be doing now is raising my gavel at 5 minutes, but then you'll hear an alarm go off when you've hit 7 minutes. And if you go much beyond that, I will gavel down, just because I think it's important, as a respect for all colleagues and everybody here, that we be able to get through questions and keep giving people opportunities to ask. So that is the new plan. And with that, Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had my finger there to unmute, and I appreciate the presentation again by the school department, superintendent, her team. I also appreciate the advocates and the teachers in particular, as today is National Teacher Day, or National Teacher Appreciation Day. So thank you for all the work that you continue to do. I often joke, after spending 13 years in a classroom, it was too much for me, so I ran for office. Because the work that you all do really is tremendous. And I appreciate Nate thanking teachers at the BTU school. My boys are at Boston Latin Academy and Boston Latin School, so I'd like to thank their teachers, especially for dealing with them during these times. And a special shout out on National Teacher Appreciation Day to all of my former colleagues at East Boston High, who continue to do a tremendous amount of work on behalf of our students and, of course, all of our teachers across the district. And I also appreciate Chairwoman Bach for recognizing that we were planning a hearing on inclusion specifically outside of the budget process, but due to changes in how we do business, we had postponed that, but I will use this time to ask some questions regarding inclusion. And really appreciate the renewed focus from lots of different parties, in addition to teachers who have been, and families who have been asking for inclusion to be done right across our district, and appreciate the commitment of the superintendent and her team to make sure that we're doing that for our kids. Can either the superintendent or a member of your team talk a little bit about how we're defining inclusion in our district? What does that look like to a family maybe exploring inclusion for their students? I also am interested in as a part of that definition, what does it mean for the adults in that classroom? So the number of students on an IEP versus the number of students that we'll call, for lack of maybe a better term, a gen ed student. How many wait lists, how many students are waitlisted for inclusion seats across the district, and where do we have openings? Because in a few of our schools, we actually have open inclusion seats and then a wait list for these gen ed students. So there's some conflict that does impact schools' budgets across the district. And I do have a follow-up question after that. Thank you.
I think I'm going to have to defer to David for the numbers on the inclusion, staffing, and the wait lists. I don't have that number right here.
Yeah, so I would say, in terms of how the district defines and thinks about inclusion, there are sort of two definitions of the word inclusion. One, I think, is words that folks who work in special education have been training me about, which is inclusion as a general term in special education means something different than the sort of contractual definition of inclusion that we have in Boston. The inclusion is something we're doing with all of our students, even students in substantially separate programs, to make sure they're having access for at least part of their day to inclusive settings. There's a formal inclusion program defined in the Boston Teachers Union contract as a classroom with no more than 20 students, of which no more than 6 can have an IEP with a certain number of minutes, as outlined in that sort of higher number of minutes. BPS, as best practice, has said that those classrooms are also staffed with a paraprofessional. So I do feel like I just need to clarify that all of our inclusion classrooms are staffed with 2 adults. That second adult is sometimes a paraprofessional. And so sort of in terms of ratios, the class size is 20 with 6 as a max. But then you might have students with lower need IEPs in that room. Perhaps a student who's just getting speech therapy services or resource room services provided by other teachers who aren't the main classroom staff. And that's limited at no more than half of the students in the room total. So 3 more students beyond the 6, potentially if there are 6. Generally, as a best practice in the system, we aim for about 5 students. So class size max of 20 with a breakdown of 15 and 5, maybe 1 or 2 additional students on lower need IEPs. And the established district practice as a part of our rollout that happened about 7 years ago now was 1 teacher and 1 paraprofessional as the model. We also have a really extensive group of other models. We've heard about some of them today, where schools have generated their own versions of what their inclusion model might look like. So some schools have 1.5 teachers and a half para, or 2 teachers and a higher class size, and so on.
Do we sometimes have that in classrooms that aren't sort of coded inclusion? We would have, there is always a potential to have, I think about my own years teaching, where I had a classroom that had so many kids, but did not have those additional supports. So is there a way through whether we code a classroom roster that after you hit so many students that are on an IEP that you have the paraprofessional support your work?
Right now, if a classroom is coded as a general education classroom, and the students who are entering that classroom are getting special education supports, those supports are provided by a special education teacher who is not a classroom teacher, generally a resource teacher in the school.
Great, and I see that the gavel's up. I will have some additional questions on inclusion in the next round. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Sabi George. Next up is Council President Janey, and then I'll post the rest of the order in the chat in a second. Councillor Janey. Councillor Janey. All right. For a second, I'll skip her and go to Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to get into the questions really quick, thank you for the presentation, but to make most of my time. In terms of funding for the Look bill, I know we spoke on this sometime in March, I think, or February. The superintendent came and gave a presentation.
You just went on mute.
Just went muted, Councillor.
Sorry, I was talking for a while on mute, so thank you for that. Very quickly, I know that in February or March, when you came to speak to the council superintendent, there was some conversation about the Look bill and hiring somebody to sort of put together a plan for how to handle ELL. And I think you hired that person either that day or soon thereafter, and then we got hit by COVID. If we could just get an update on, one, what that person has put together. 2, when we talk about funding dual language schools and trying to put together the programming that we need, how this budget does that and how this budget could be better for that. Specifically, I did ask it earlier, but I'll re-ask it now. As it applies to English language learners with disabilities, what our capacity is to address that, how we can build that capacity. It's a language proficiency thing, but it might also be a cultural proficiency thing. And so ways in which we can deal with that. And I'll save other questions for round 2, just to kind of try and keep this efficient.
Yeah, Councillor, thank you for that. The dual language supports, we have some funding in this budget for that, and Nate can speak to that, but really it's more of a facility issue, so we have to ramp up our Build PPS community engagement process again, and of course that's on hold. So that's tied up with that, but we do have funding for the dual language in this budget. The update on the bilingual plan, that's Dr. Delis Reyes, who is doing that work, who came in to do the work. We also have a national search for her replacement. She came in just temporarily to help us and has a lot of historical knowledge to help us get that work going. She's been working with the ELL task force on some of that work. And then we also have, just so you know, beginning to look at ethnic studies and formalizing ethnic studies courses in the district.
Great, thank you.
If that's, hold on, I didn't know that would be that quick. If I could just ask one more question, then while I have you,
yes.
What efforts are we making right now with ELL in the COVID pandemic to really engage English language learners online? Are we doing any special programming? What can we do there, especially considering that we may be looking at this for not just now, but September, October? There's a possibility we still need to do that. So in what ways are we engaging on that?
So that's in multiple ways. The first is that the ELL teachers are reaching out to their students just like any other teachers are having to meet with their students. So, you know, if that's a sheltered English class, then they're, you know, those teachers are reaching out to their student body, of course, in providing the service. The second is translation services in our OEL offices being accessed quite a bit for translation services for our teachers so that they can have translation services in their remote learning environment. And then the third piece is that we are using our student support teams now as we identify students who have not yet engaged or having trouble getting Wi-Fi or dependable Wi-Fi goes off and then they have to put it back on or whatever. So we're helping to make sure that they're getting the supports with being connected in the remote environment. And if they're not getting support or they're falling behind, then they're given tier 2 interventions and supports from other support professionals within the school. Of course, I've talked about the equity roundtable already so that, you know, school principals and leaders are being supported from the school community on those equity roundtables at the school level, which is an important piece that we're doing. And then Andrea Zayas and the whole academic team has specific EL resources that are on our website, our remote learning website for parents and for our educators.
Thank you so much.
Great. Are you all set, Councilor Arroyo?
I am, thank you.
Great, perfect, thank you. All right, next up, we're going back to Council President Janey, and then it will be Councilor Mejia. And I have posted the order. Sorry, I thought I had sent it to everyone, but I had sent it privately. So Council President Janey, you have the floor. Councilor Janey, you're still muted. All right, hers is still not working. Okay, so we'll come back to you again, Councilor Janey. Councilor Mejia, please go ahead.
Yes, can you see me? Is my mic on and everything?
I can see you and hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Kenzie, Councilor Bach, Chairwoman Councilor Bach. So like Emma and Mary Claire both said during their public testimonies, some teachers have certifications for general education and special education. Inclusion classrooms are required to have a general education teacher as well as a special education teacher in addition to paraprofessional. What happens if the special education teacher or the paraprofessional is out sick? What percentage of general education students are certified for special education? And how large are class sizes for inclusion classrooms? What percentage increase or decrease is this over time? That's one question. And while we're talking about inclusion and special education in ELs, I just want to really make note that not all of our students are in Black and brown students in particular, not all of our students are in special education or ELs. We have a lot of students who are also in general education, and I think it's important to make sure that we're thinking about the equity pieces across all aspects of the education landscape, not just in the buckets that most folks want to just put our kids in. I am also curious about right now the assessment for all students to monitor learning loss is critical. English language learners, students with special needs and low income, and we cannot wait for in-person support. You know, it's a civil rights issue, and I'm just really curious around what we're going to do to ensure that we're not making our kids wait until school and for in-person support services. In terms of special education, we're seeing some cuts to early childhood special education. What reason is it for those cuts? I'm just curious as to why. ELL and bilingual education plan, I'm gonna be very specific about some things. One of the things that we have seen is the impact of COVID-19 has had on English learners, especially in homes where parents do not speak English. Simply put, a lot of ELL students aren't learning at the same capacity if they would have been in school. How does this budget set aside funds to essentially pick up the slack that COVID-19 has created? How are we reaching out to parents of English language learners during this time who do not speak English? And what ways are we incorporating their voices and making room for them in this process? I think for me, as a parent who went to Boston Public Schools, I feel like oftentimes I'm having the same conversation and expecting different results. And the characters keep changing, but the discrepancies that continue to exist in the Boston Public Schools are chronic. And I am really looking to this administration and really grateful to Superintendent Casilius for all her efforts around equity. But it's getting to the point that a lot of people out here are losing trust in the system. And so I really think that we have an opportunity to restore that trust in it, and that is going to be more about just the budget and the dollars. It's really about how we're allocating resources and human capital and doing right by all students. So we'd just like to get some answers on that.
So I'm going to go ahead and start, and then David, if you could give some of the specific answers to some of the number questions that she has, or Mr. Cooter, that'd be fine. I want to just talk about strategic plan and the fact that we pulled out cultivate trust as one of the biggest issues and amplify voice. I know I've said that in the previous hearing as well, and that is why those two bullets are in our strategic plan, because that's what the community told us, and we heard it and we listened. And so you'll see that we, I mentioned that the day after we closed, we instituted with Dr. Granson's leadership, the equity roundtables. And then just a few weeks later, we implemented the school-based equity roundtables. Boston Public Schools never had this before, because we knew it was going to be critical for our school leaders to be in contact with their school communities, to be able to reach students and to reach families during this time. And so that was critical to building trust and to listening to the community and amplifying their voice. So I think that that structure isn't just going to be in COVID. We're going to keep that going as we begin to look at kind of almost community organizing at the level of the school to the district level. And it's really going to provide for us a really great lens on what's happening within the community, what partnerships are available at school, and then how do we better serve our children and their families and overall the whole community. And so I think that's going to be a really great new addition that we got really because of COVID. We had the equity roundtables, we had the OAG task force, but this is just much broader. I mean, to have 80 to 100 people on these calls, and then for schools to have 12, 25 people show up for their council, it's just giving us a whole new opportunity to be families. So I'm really excited about that. As for COVID and the remediation we have to do with COVID for our EL learners, that's going to be really specific to learning and seeing where they're at in terms of their English acquisition and their skill set in the content area. They'll take the regular assessments that everybody else takes, but then we'll also, through the student support team, know what other supports that they need in order to better program for them during the summer. I think parents are going to want to partner with us in the summer, because I think we'll still have some remote learning during the summertime, and I think parents are going to want their kids to be engaged, so we'll do those supports during that. And I think the budget that we'll use for that will be the stimulus budget that is intended to help mitigate for some of these costs associated to COVID. The other thing you asked about general ed, this is a really important question. I know we covered it at the previous hearing, talking more about general education and the budget and how the budget was based around equity for all students and as a civil rights issue. We presented a lot of data on student achievement when we first started doing the strategic planning. We presented data to the school committee about where our Black and Brown students were, where our EL students were, where our special ed students were in terms of the gaps in their learning and the lack of access or opportunity that they have and that we were seeing. So we presented all kinds of data. Chief Accountability Officer Corey Harris made a very compelling presentation to the school committee about where we are at the Boston Public Schools. We also received the review from the DESE and giving us a good glimpse into where we're at with English language learners and special education programming and the district supports for that. We've taken all of that into account into thinking about this budget and really the 3-year budget that we're asking the City Council to consider as we begin to really implement with strong fidelity the things that we are committing to in the strategic plan. And we're starting with the general population in the 33 most underperforming schools. So that is where we're going to hit our Black and Brown achievement gap and begin to work. In our literacy adoption, that is the other big piece. And in the professional development we're going to be doing with teachers around efficacy and around our standards alignment and the way that we assess our students for learning and then the way we program for them differently. So, that's the deep work in this budget.
Thank you. It seems like we're not going to be able to go. I see the graph. I see the thingamajiggy.
I'll try to be brief in my.
Yeah, no, I got to be really honest with this process. It's like, I think that we have a lot of people who are tuning in different ways. And I think that we get really lengthy with not just you, the superintendent, we do appreciate your feedback, but I think that we need to really be mindful of who's watching and just keep it simple, keep it direct, and use the simplest terms to break it down so that our parents can really understand what it is that we're communicating and just really bullet it if you have to speak, just so that we can all follow along. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. I want to next see if we've got Council President Janey back.
Is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh my God, I don't know what that was. It's like my face covering on my photo avatar here was trying to muffle me, but I will not be silenced. So anyway, glad to join you. Thank you. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. Want to shout out all the teachers on the call. Happy Teachers Day. I share your concerns around inclusion. I have just a few points I just want to kind of talk through, please. So number one, want to understand where we are with the look bill. From what I can tell, it looks like we're moving slow to take advantage of this funding and moving forward with new opportunities. I'm really excited about expanding dual language that you talked about earlier. I hope there's a plan in place for new programs, especially around expansion of dual language. I'd love to hear more about that. Number two, in terms of family engagement, I understand some of these new positions are going to schools where the language is 50% a language other than English. I wonder how many schools that is. This is critically important, how we engage the parents of our English language learners and students that are not English language learners who have parents at home who do not speak English. That's also an issue. And so how we engage those families is critically important. And I wonder how that's breaking down, through the remote learning, and wondering if we could have not just the racial breakdowns as we asked for, but making sure we understand the language breakdown. Number three, concerns about students with disabilities who are also English language learners. This has been a concern of mine from, back when I worked at MAC. And I haven't really seen the district build its capacity to really deal with this group of students well. And so I wonder where we are around identifying, assessing, and testing to provide the appropriate programming for English language learners who also have disabilities. Number four, inclusion. As I said at the beginning, I share the concerns that the teachers on the call raised. This has been an issue that I've been raising since I've been on this council. I would be interested what the superintendent's vision is for inclusion. You know, I've been looking to the O'Hearn-Henderson model. I believe we need a general ed and a special ed teacher in the classroom. I wonder how many classrooms right now currently have that. So I wonder how many classrooms, you know, what percentage of students, and then of those classrooms that do have it, what is the breakdown of those students by race and by language and by neighborhood? Sub-separate, we know that the flip side of inclusion, and inclusion for it to be done right, if we don't do it right, it's just dumping into general ed and calling it inclusion, which is why I think the two-teacher model is important. But sub-separate, we know that most of the kids that are in sub-separate are Black and brown. There was a report that came out some years ago. I'm interested in what progress we've made. And then the other side is sub-separate, where the Black and Latino, particularly boys, so I want to elevate too that this is a boy issue, and we saw it on one of the slides. But those who make it out of BPS and go to a private placement, you know, how much is that costing us? What's the breakdown by race and by neighborhood and by language of who's going out of district, and then looking at who is in sub-separate within our district and breaking that down by race and by neighborhood and by language. And then that is it for me, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor.
Okay. I'll take my feedback from Councilor Mejia and be bulleted in my responses. So the look bill is being worked on by Dr. Delis Reyes, and we don't have that yet done. She came in right before COVID, and she has been working with the ELL task force on that. We are expanding dual language in both Cape Verde and Vietnamese, and we have a number of other dual language programs. We're just trying to find the right space for the Vietnamese dual language program, but we are committed to doing that. Family engagement, we have the family engagement liaisons. One thing that we did do when we did the family survey that we just did was get a lot of responses. I think we had 43% of our families respond. We also have that data disaggregated, and we know the data directly. It wasn't an anonymous survey, so we've given that information to our school leaders, and they're following up on it. So if someone in a family survey said, I need a Chromebook, now the principal has that information, and they're able to call that family and get them the Chromebook. So that survey has been great. We used technology to call all our families, and we've just had a terrific response rate at almost 50%. The special ed ELs, we're working on a plan with our special ed department. I think that they have a plan that they've been working on. I've been told it's supposed to be ready for next school year. And that would be aligned then to professional development for teachers who are teaching this specific group with special ed and EL. The percent of students in inclusion and by neighborhood, I'm going to have to defer to my teammates to get that information to you. I don't know if they have it here today yet, or if we'll have...
To be clear, when I say inclusion, the two-teacher model inclusion, not what we're calling inclusion, but the actual gen ed, special ed teacher inclusion. I wonder how many of our classrooms look like that, and which kids are in those types of classrooms.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, we'll get that for you. And then the sub-separate, this is something that I came into Boston, and I just really was, quite honestly, very surprised to see that there were so many students, especially Black and brown students, in sub-separate. So I did hire Tammy Poost, a specialist in special ed, to come lead the team. She is a legal advisor in special ed. I also have just restructured a position within our equity office to work specifically on disproportionality. And so we'll be working on disproportionality that will liaison with the special ed department to be able to take on the issues of sub-separate. And I know that gavel's up, but I will talk with you more about that offline.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Council President Janey. Next up, we've got Councilor Flynn. Councilor Flynn, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Block, and thank you, Councilor Block, and thank you, Superintendent. I will try to be very brief. I know some of the questions were already asked. I was meeting informally with parents, Asian parents, and they asked me to bring up the following question. I know some of them wanted to testify, but they weren't able to. But I try to summarize their questions. In terms of support of EL with special needs, how is language support being implemented? Do we have teachers who speak their language and able to communicate with families also? And if not, how much investment will we address having teachers that speak the students' language? You know, the challenge I have as the district city councilor is a lot of the parents especially want to be engaged, but they also have language challenges. Poverty is an issue, access to computer as well. So kind of all of those issues rolled into one, Superintendent. Just want to see what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think that surrounding the parents and helping the parents with language acquisition is really important. And I know we talked about it, I can't remember which counselor asked the question about getting parents help with their own language acquisition. And so I have that front of mind to talk to Monica Roberts, Chief of Parent Advancement. I know that they do hold some language classes for parents through their parent university. And so I'll put that back here to talk with her about it. As for teacher languages and having language support, you know, we really do strive to have our teachers be multilingual. I don't have the exact percentages of our teachers who are multilingual. I know we discussed it earlier, but I will make sure we get you that information so you can know. And there are several teachers who are multilingual and do speak, but certainly the majority of our teachers are English speakers. But I do think we have a number of our staff members who also speak multiple languages. I think we could be more deliberate about which schools are being assigned teachers who have the languages that are most spoken at those schools. That is exactly why we did the family liaison position at schools that are over 50% one language, so that parents would have an advocate at the school. So with that, I think I answered your question.
Yes, thank you, Superintendent. Superintendent, I have other questions. I'm going to email them to you in the interest of time. And again, thank you for the work. And thank you also, especially to our teachers for their tremendous work and working so hard in teaching and educating our young students. So we want to say thank you to our teachers as well.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Councillor Flynn. Before going on to my colleagues, I'm just going to inject myself for a minute, just because I'm actually going to be passing the chair's baton to my vice chair, Councillor Sabi George, at 4 o'clock. So I guess the quick question I wanted to ask as a follow-up, because I think it was Dave, it might have been Nate who corrected and said, you know, there's always 2 adults in the inclusion classrooms. I know that I had a conversation with Gannett, who teaches at the Early, who was on earlier, about the fact that, well, the majority of the classrooms that her inclusion students there moved through the day in had multiple teachers, that when they came to science, they only had her because she was certified in special ed. And there wasn't a para, there wasn't a second anybody in the room. And so I wanted to ask, I know that's a specific question, but I think it gets to this like bigger picture question that a lot of us have been pushing on and that some of the advocates pushed on, of sort of like, how much consistency you can expect on an inclusion front.
Right, and I think it's a great question because it speaks to a sort of very detailed technical problem that is one that we need to address, which is, you know, when does a paraprofessional get to go on their break? And when do teachers do their P&Ds and other planning? I think one of the things we're looking to improve is better scheduling of when para breaks happen, so that the paras may be going on break at a time when a student's IEP needs aren't relevant or there aren't accommodations that are needed. IEPs that are written for inclusion, all in our formal inclusion program, have 4 hours of special education services written in throughout the day. That's only part of the day. And for the rest of the day, the student is functionally in general education, right? They don't need accommodation for their learning in that. You can imagine, students who are fine in a PE class or an art class without an accommodation for a disability that might be interfering with their reading or math comprehension scores. And so we're trying to make sure that all the grade level teams are building out schedules for when paras and other teachers go on breaks, so that if there's ever a moment of the day where one of those two adults is on a break, that students are not in a place where they need to be getting required IEP services.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like in that specific example, that schedule was not ideal.
Yeah.
I also just want to flag, just again, to pull back one level, that when we're talking about our students, we talk about making sure there are two adults in every classroom. If there's a student who has a specific IEP, it's moving away from the individualized nature of what we're talking about. And I'm often reminded of a conversation I had with Ann Clark, the headmaster of the Boston Arts Academy, where she said that when you're at the Arts Academy, you really start to question what it means to have a disability. Because she had students in her school who have an IEP for math, and they need a lot of individualized attention, a lot of academic supports to be able to meet grade level expectations in math. And then you go and you hear them sing and they're pitch perfect. And she says, what is a disability? Well, we define in a lot of our special education identification rates, struggles in math or in core subjects as the cause of needing additional supports. And when we start talking about then a kid who's struggling at reading, having to have two adults in the physical education class, or having two adults in every single class, we start to move away from the individualized nature of what we're trying to do, the inclusive nature of really looking at students, their abilities, and their needs. And we get to a place where we're starting to serve adults and say, we just need to have two adults with every kid during this time because that kid has this label. And so that I'm drawing back one level even more beyond what David was saying, just to say that what our job to do and what we have to do even more, and it applies specifically to English learners with disabilities, that we really need to be taking a whole school approach. That's why we're starting to talk about multi-tier systems of support, to look at individual childs and make sure that the supports are fluid throughout the day and moving to the students who need it the most.
Thank you, Nate. No, I appreciate that. Although my impression of this case is not that it is a student who doesn't need support. I think it's that it's relying on her her special ed license for that student in that time. And I just want to stress that in my mind, science is a subject in which a student who needs support around math needs that support in science. A student who needs support around writing needs that support in science, right? Because it's a topic that pulls the two. And so the idea that we might be structuring a schedule where we're resolving something like that break problem by shorting the kind of specialist academic subject that I think can be just as important for all our students' learning would be a major mistake. So I don't want us to go too far down the rabbit hole of one particular case because we don't have the facts in front of us, but I just really want to highlight that because I think that's the kind of thing people are talking about when they talk about consistency here. And then my second question is just on ELL. You've mentioned a couple of times, Superintendent, the sort of rollout on the, I think it's the Vietnamese and Haitian Creole programs. Is that, you're muted, Superintendent.
Haitian Creole is already.
Haitian Creole is in.
It's already in, but the Cape Verdean and the Vietnamese would be new.
Right, and can you just speak a little bit to, what exactly is the concrete investment in developing those programs right now? Because I know those communities, I mean, they're not in my district, but I've certainly heard in the broader ELL community, they've been looking for that for a long time. And I think people looking at the budget weren't quite clear kind of where to find the money for making substantive steps forward on that front this year. So I just love a little more detail on that. And that's my last question.
Yeah, there's $400K in the budget set aside to be able to do professional development and curriculum development to support the English learners, to support the development of the dual language program. This is separate from any staffing costs that would come for a dual language program. And so we do have 6 existing English dual language programs, 4 Spanish dual language programs, an ASL dual language program, and a Haitian Creole dual language program. We're also, as part of our curriculum rollout for next year, as part of the literacy, looking at dual language curriculum for those schools that are doing dual language Spanish. So there's part of that 2.5 million, a smaller part proportional to the number of students, will be going to dual language. And then, of course, we're developing new and partnering with the Cape Verdean community and with the Vietnamese community to roll out new programs in the coming years. And so any set aside money that you see will be about central supports for that program development. And then the program itself will be funded through the weighted student funding that will come once enrollment is given and the new programs are started.
So it's $400,000 for the development of those two programs this year.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Great. Yeah. And I'll just lift up that I think that, I appreciate superintendent and the need to do an audit and figure out a strategy and you've made the hire around the Look Act stuff. I think just to echo Counselor Edwards, there's just a ton of anxiety right now that even though that might be a good long range planning direction, that one of the gaps that's being so intensified by the COVID thing is around the ELL community. And so I think a lot of anxiety about kind of how can we accelerate the ramp up speed on some of that stuff. But I've used my time. So I want to recognize Counselor Breeden. Counselor Breeden, you have the floor. Go.
Hi. Thank you so much for all your presentations this afternoon. I had a quick question about when someone is a newcomer student from another, with maybe coming from another country is there an evaluation of their former level of education? How do they, even if they speak no English, their level of, if they've had some education in their own language, in their own home country, they definitely have the base. They have a lot more tools in their kit than someone who has had very little. How do you sort those students out as they arrive?
So our Newcomers Assessment Center is in charge of when a student comes, they take a home language survey to understand what languages are spoken in the home. Based on their responses to that, they'll go to the Newcomers Assessment Center, who assesses their English language development level and identifies what programs they're eligible for. They also have a screening to be able to identify students that we refer to as SLIFE. It's students with limited or interrupted formal education. That's, I think, going in a different direction that you were talking about, but for students who may not have had access to formal education or who may have had interruption for a variety of reasons, they get a specialized program. That specialized program has both ESL instruction and then native language literacy instruction as well. Because I think what you're referring to there is we know that if students have that academic proficiency in their home language, transferring it to English is easier than if they have to both develop English and be brought up to grade level. Part of the dual language push also is the recognition that students who can receive their instruction in that home language are going to be able to keep pace with the core academics and not have to have separate time where we're just focused only on language acquisition in English. And so the current models are really about acquiring academic language in English, and sometimes the feeling is that that's at the expense of the time that they would be spent in their content areas. The current English recommendation is 2.5 hours of ESL instruction for an ELD level 1 per day. You can imagine 2.5 hours of a high school day is a lot of instruction in English, missing out on a lot of core instruction. And so that's part of the push for more flexible models. But really, it's the Newcomers Assessment Center that has the team, and they're constantly developing tools to be able to assess those students who need to develop language proficiency, and also those students who may have had interruptions in their education.
Yeah, I think, given you don't know what the background is, some of them refugees from a war-torn country or a natural disaster, they've been displaced. So many students have a pretty good grounding in education, maybe in their home, in their native language. So being able to accommodate them without taking away from their other academic subjects, just to learn English, is very important. There's one other question. Oh, in terms of the context of our remote learning right now, I don't know, are we accommodating, I don't know how we accommodate for different learning styles, because so much of it is visual, perhaps, or I don't know, auditory. I need to sit in on some classes to learn how this is going, but how are we accommodating for different learning styles in this COVID crisis and distance learning? In terms of auditory, kinetic, whatever.
Yeah. I think that, you know, we have teachers who will be given 5 hours of professional development that we were able to secure with the BTU agreement, and they will get, you know, formalized training on how to do remote learning so that students are engaged and taking in account for what, you know, what the aspects are and what the best practices are around remote learning, as well as they are learning from their peers and their colleagues. And so there's teacher teams and teacher groups, and they're sharing best practice across the district.
That's good. Yeah, we're all in the same boat. This is a worldwide effort right now. Oh, I just want a question about resource room pullouts. What proportion of your special ed students are access a resource room and are pulled out for resource room teaching?
I don't have that number. I can come back to it though.
About a percent of the students with disabilities. Okay, so it's about 3,800 students out of the 10,000 students overall. So sort of between 35 and 40%. Now, that's using the old definition of resource room. We, by and large, resource room isn't the only model where students who used to be referred to as students who got resource room, who got sort of lesser amounts of special ed time, are serviced by a resource room teacher, but that might be in a push-in model.
Push-in model? Yeah.
Meaning the teacher supports go into the classroom, into the general ed classroom, rather than going out into a discrete classroom with just the one teacher.
And then if there's some students that an accommodation would be that they need to come, if they want to focus on a particular subject area, they need to a more quiet space, then those are the students you might pull out to a separate space to work with. Okay. All right, that seems to be all I have for the moment. Thank you very much. Kenzie, is that Anissa?
Yes, yes, sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Councillor Breeden. Appreciate that. And thank you for staying inside time. All right, so a couple quick things. I am now going to pass the chair's baton to Councillor Asabi George, who, as I mentioned before, is my vice chair on Ways and Means and the chair of education, and really the co-chair of this hearing, which you know, sort of combining with her inclusion hearing order. I just want to note a couple of things though before I pass the baton. So right now, there's a remaining order for the council for questions of councillors Flaherty, then O'Malley, then Campbell, then Wu. Right now, I just see O'Malley and Campbell on the list. But that's the order that Councillor Asabi George will be recognizing people in. I just want to note for the whole council that there is a 5 o'clock CPA hearing. And also we have about 20 minutes of public testimony videos that were submitted that will be played at the conclusion of this hearing that need to be played prior to that 5 o'clock start time, since Carrie can only run one Zoom at once. So Councillor Asabi George will really be ending the councillor question period here around 4:35 or so. And so just need everybody to keep that in mind, that that's a real hard stop. And I will be back as soon as I deal with my 4 o'clock thing, but not sure exactly how long that will take. So since I may not be here at the adjournment, I just really want to, on my own behalf, again, thank the administration for being here. And also thank the many counselors. I mean, the focus area here of inclusion, special ed, and ELL really came to be because of the number of questions that people were raising about it in advance of the budget process. And I just know it's going to be a continued area that the council wants to focus on with the administration, all 3 of those topics. I will pass the gavel, figuratively, to.
I'm catching it, and I'm going to stop my timer and call on, I think it's Councilor O'Malley that's next. Councilor O'Malley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you, Sue and your team. Can we talk a little bit about out-of-district placement, Superintendent? I know that we've touched upon that in some of the earlier things, but what do you or Nate or whomever, David, can you talk about our total expense in out-of-district placement?
Yep. Let me just pull that right up. So our total expense in out-of-district placement is rising for FY21, but it's only rising with the cost of programs increasing. The state sets a rate at which programs are allowed to increase their rates, and our expected costs are expected to increase by that rate. And I have the total right here. I believe it's just about, yeah, there it is. So it's increasing from just under $40 million in the current year to just under 41. So 39.6 to 3.7 million. And that is just a reflection of the increase in state rate, expected increase in state rates. Great. Now, also, I would note that of that, about 75% over the first about $50,000 of costs is reimbursed by the state through their circuit breaker provision. That is one of the provisions we're keeping an eye on as the waiver just came through about what could change about state aid going forward. They reset that reimbursement rate every year. That's a place that we could be really hurt if the state lowers their reimbursement rate for circuit breaker.
Certainly, no, it's a very valid point. And does that $41 million include transportation costs associated with the out-of-district placement?
It does not. We wouldn't look that up.
Do you have that handy, or do you have that?
I could get it very shortly.
Okay, great. So maybe if you could get that. Well, Superintendent, I wanted to commend you on the terrific decision. I hope I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, but about some changes in terms of some new hires as it relates to implementing and sort of overseeing and supporting inclusionary programs.
Yes, we're really excited about some leadership changes that are going to be happening in our special education department, as well as in our schools, to be able to provide some additional support to some of our schools, especially our transformation schools.
Fair enough, and I think I'll leave it at that. Excited to hear some great plans in the mix. Obviously we've heard from a number of teachers, and I want to echo our incredible, deep, and sincere appreciation. I know you and your team shares as well. Inclusion is a model that I know we all know works, and know that we need to make sure that we can fund it and make sure that the supports are there. But just to sort of really underscore, and again, I know we're all singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. We all know this. It is just so vital to make sure that we are able to, particularly in a time of post-pandemic or pandemic, to have those supports available. So I just think of so many schools in my district, specifically the Manning School in Jamaica Plain, Curley School, so many great programs happening there at the Kilmer as well to support those students and their families. It's just so important, and it's particularly important during remote learning time. So I appreciate your focus on that. One of the things that I'm incredibly proud of my time on the body is working to support the creation of the first two-way bilingual high school in the Commonwealth, the Margarita Muñiz Academy on Child Street in Jamaica Plain. And Dr. D, we call her, Danya Vasquez, does a remarkable job with her staff there. Can you talk a little bit about expanding that model to more high schools, or at least perhaps some of the programming that they have at Muñiz and some of the other high schools as well going forward, as it relates to supports for ELLs and a true immersion type system?
Well, I can generally speak to it. We are going to have a high school redesign presentation to the school committee shortly. because that work is ongoing. But there's been a lot of discussion about expansion of dual language, because we are trying to, as part of the Build PPS, create pathways for students that grow in the UPK all the way through and connect then to elementary school, and then the elementary school all the way through the high school. So we are planning to really begin to build 7 larger comprehensive high schools. I think I've been pretty public about that. As part of the redesign, and having grades 7 through 12 in those high schools, and a myriad of programming, from dual language to career pathway programming, performing arts, visual arts programming, clubs and athletic activities, all of those things that would be something to be very proud of.
That's great. And can you talk about sort of just the difference between substantially separate classrooms and inclusions? My late sister actually was an inclusion specialist at the Condon School in South Boston, going back, gosh, 10, 15 years now. But can you talk about sort of the movement, you know, the number of substantially separate classrooms, has that decreased, you know, over a 5 or 10 year period, and has been the move in the trend to be able to offer those students more supports in an inclusionary type classroom?
I can speak to you the philosophy while David looks for the number on whether they've gone down or up. I can tell you I've been surprised by the number of classrooms that we do have.
Yeah.
It appears to me just from this year that we do end up going up and needing more classrooms, where I'd rather be going up and needing more inclusionary classrooms.
Sure.
So I know there's a couple of expansions of inclusion this year, but it'd be nice to be able to have more of inclusionary environments for children. I believe in heterogeneous grouping in children. As people know, I'm not big on, you know, separating out children and tracking children.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my philosophy. I know one of the counselors asked earlier about my philosophy, and it's to have children in the least restrictive environment in order to have them fully included to the best of their capacity based on the IEP that's been agreed to by their teachers and the specialists that support that family and that family. So that's my philosophy. I know that David probably...
Absolutely. I think we all agree.
And also I hired somebody just recently and part of these changes to work specifically on this issue of disproportionality within the district, especially for our Black and Brown youth and Black and Brown boys. And that person is going to be monitoring the data. It's housed in our equity office. It will liaison with our special ed office, and we'll work with our director of special education to help us with, or assistant superintendent of special education to help us dismantle this sub-separate. And we're going to be looking to successful models, you know, such as the Mendel School, the Manning School, to help us understand better how to do inclusion right.
Absolutely.
Great, and then I think David's going to add a little something to that, and then we'll be going to Councillor Campbell. Thank you, Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilor O'Malley, to your earlier question about transportation costs for students served outside the district, I was forgetting where to find it, and I helpfully remembered it's on our Explore Budget website. So I just pulled up the Explore Budget website and clicked into transportation and found that it's about $6.3 million we spend on students in outplacement settings. There's a small part of that that relates to vocational ed, but it's mostly for students with disabilities. And then to your question about the numbers of special ed sub-separate classrooms, we're seeing increases in the number of inclusion classrooms and the number of substantially separate classrooms at the moment. Mostly that has to do with the expansion we're seeing in the number of students diagnosed with autism and the increased classrooms we need to create as more students are identified, especially at the age of 3. For that program, they tend to be identified as needing substantially separate programming at that early childhood level. That is one of the many things the superintendent has directed us to look at.
No, absolutely. Appreciate that. Thank you for all your work. I know this is incredibly important, among the most important we do, so thank you. Can I just ask, David, is that Tintin behind you in that painting?
Sure is. That's a keen eye.
Excellent. Well done. Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Councillor Sabi George. Just a lot of my questions were asked and answered, but really wanted to stress the pieces around the dual language program and the Look Bill and the dual language program for the Vietnamese community, Cape Verdean community, and some of the other things that were mentioned, it would be helpful to have a timeline, action, and sort of in terms of the when, right? So when we go back to communities to say there will be a dual language program for the Vietnamese community or the Cape Verdean community, when that might actually happen. And then some of my questions have to do with substantially separate classrooms, and I know some other folks have brought this up, but specifically if there is data tracking, boys, particularly boys of color, being placed in substantially separate classrooms over the last few years, if we could see that, that would be helpful. And in that response, if we could also, or if the district could also provide, what is a strategy in terms of changing that? I know I heard some of the response earlier, but pulling it apart a little bit more in terms of not just the strategy and how we're going to combat it, but a timeline attached to that. And some of the other questions I had, I can put in writing and just send just for the sake of time. But two things I did want to stress. One is this restructuring conversation we continue to have, that, how it connects to those schools that have high concentrations of English language learners and special needs students, and how they have to obviously bear the responsibility of instructing those students, and how hard that is, and how we get the district or all schools to share in the burden of that. So what does that look like in terms of our high schools, this restructuring, so that everyone's sharing, and I shouldn't say the burden, excuse my language, sharing in the responsibility of educating our students who are special needs and English language learners? What does that restructuring look like at the high school level, so that it is more adequately, our students are more adequately dispersed across all of our schools? And then the second question is, early on, and I think this was in context of maybe Councilor Edwards' questions around English language learners and the Edwards Middle School and some other schools in the district, and how they, we're putting investments there to make sure that those folks are not harmed, and I'm putting that in quotes. I want to sort of push back on that a little bit, because in the previous budget hearing on this very issue of, schools are going to a K-6, K-8 model, and those standalone middle schools, including like the Timothy, for example, where I was a student when I was a BPS kid, obviously are not going to expand to a K-6 or K-8. So what is the plan for those schools? And in one of the hearings previous, it was said that we would never have enough resources to pour into, for example, the Edwards School to make it excellent. And what I mean by that is to give it the arts, all of the programming it would need to serve those students there, including many students who are special ed students. There was obviously conversation around inclusion classrooms. So what do we do with these schools that are sort of stuck in limbo when we know we don't have an adequate amount of resources to pour into that school to make it excellent for those students and families that are going there? So I want to be careful that we say not harming, but they are being currently harmed in the current condition in which they find themselves. So those are my two questions, one around the restructuring of our high schools to share responsibility, and then these schools that are sort of stuck in limbo, that have a lot of students who are English language learners and the special needs students, and a combination, of course. What are we doing with those schools?
Yeah, so thank you, Counselor, for your questions. I'm gonna get back to the timeline question on the Vietnamese is K2 would be opening in September. The Cape Verdean has a high school course that we're planning for that would probably be spring of next school year, and then hopefully opening up the following early childhood program the following year. So that's kind of the timeline.
What year is that, Superintendent?
2020.
Okay.
Yeah, the following year. The high school redesign questions that you're asking are still in the planning stages. We've been working with the headmasters this year. We have 7 high schools that have been working on that planning. That we're almost ready to present to the school committee soon. Obviously, COVID put us behind schedule just a little bit as we've been finalizing that. As you can tell by some of my principal moves, we started to move on some of that high school work, and you can, because they're also in transformation. So how they're going to share the responsibility and how they're going to work together is going to be very, very obvious. That will become very evident soon. As for the sub-separate and the timeline for that, it's now. I've hired Tammy Poost to do that work. She came in January. And she's doing sub-separate and inclusion because those two things are married and work together. You have to have inclusion done right, and we are working on the inclusion solutions all year with the BTU to try to get to those resolutions. And obviously with COVID, that has stopped. But we are going to be restarting that as soon as we possibly can to begin those conversations. I have created a new position in the equity office to deal specifically with disproportionality that will work on the sub-separate. The leadership that I have for our special ed department is a person who is specifically skilled in this area of sub-separate. So I plan on convening these individuals in this new leadership team over the next several weeks to begin to look at what we have to do to dismantle this program. What it's going to take is it's going to take really understanding how we have made these decisions in the past, and then developing programs all the way as early as K0 of support through the multi-tiered systems of support, meaning we have to do interventions with students and document those interventions, and then continue to do interventions to avoid where you go directly from, oh, there's a problem or there's a kid having a problem, and they go directly into special education and then directly into sub-separate. So that's the hard work that we have to enter in, but that's a top priority for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Counselor Campbell. We're back.
Sorry, I still had questions around just the Edwards and the latter question.
Yeah, the
more important, not the first.
If we could get through that quickly, because I do want to get to another.
The middle schools are part of the overall Build PPS plan. And so they are already part of going in the high school redesign, going to 7 through 12. So the middle schools are going to have to be coming offline to be able to do the 7 through 12s.
Thank you again, Councilor Campbell. Thank you, Superintendent. So we're back up to the top, which I have a number of outstanding questions, which I will send along and look forward to some of the information for my earlier question. We've talked a lot when we talked about inclusion and a certified teacher and a paraprofessional in the classroom. One of the concerns that I've heard for a number of years, especially with the one teacher and one para in a classroom, is paras are often pulled and used to substitute and support in other classrooms in a school community. And of course, everybody, all hands on deck, we all want to be helpful, but that really does impact the true need for that para in that particular classroom. And then if we could also talk just for a minute about the supports that we're giving and should be giving our paras to become fully licensed and certified teachers so that they can then have their own classrooms. And then also about the selection process to those paras in classrooms, making sure that we have highly qualified professionals in our classrooms and really treating them as the professionals that they are when they're working in our classrooms. That's my sort of wrap up questions, although not the end of my questions around the inclusion piece. My second question that I think Councillor Flynn maybe touched upon is really, as a district system wide, we don't have supports in place for our students who are diagnosed with dyslexia and sort of the spectrum of dyslexias that exist. So the inclusion questions wrapped up, please, and the question around appropriate and proper and high quality services for students with diagnosis of dyslexia. Thank you.
So to speak to a couple of your questions, part of the inclusion working group, even though we weren't quite able to finish part of our inclusion work with the BTU that we have been able to start this year, which has been very exciting, is additional paraprofessional PD, specifically working really collaboratively with the union leadership to help us think about PD sort of by paras for paras, right? What are the things that paras are saying they need, and how can we find paras who are exemplifying those best practices to help deliver that PD, or to just find other experts to do that. I know our Office of Human Capital has been working on expanding the para to teacher program And we've often found that MCAS can be one of the big obstacles in the parent-to-teacher program, that we have a number of paraprofessionals who've already passed sort of all of their requirements to start becoming a teacher, except for passing MCAS. And so
MTEL,
sorry, wrong. Too many. Wow, that was a bad one. So we're really proud of that. And then finally, I would just say, back to my previous point, so sort of personal thing for me is around school scheduling and supports, and really trying to make sure that we're providing robust support to school leaders on how to build schedules and operational plans so that issues with substitutes and leaves and coverage don't become as disruptive of a place. Because I agree with you, school staff will largely just say, oh yeah, of course, we'll jump in and we'll figure things out, but that can be very disruptive.
And then dyslexia.
I think so. The focus this year has been on rules-based reading and the work that we can do through Wilson and Orton Gillingham towards creating programs for that. One of the information I know in the budget collaborative process this year, every school was asked by the special education department, do you have teachers who you would like to be your point people for understanding more about rules-based reading? And then they've been offering PD specifically to those teachers around those strategies. And I think that's going to be a key part of our work to support students with dyslexia.
Great, thank you. Certainly more to come on that, because I think it's a missing link for a lot of our families and students in the Boston Public Schools. Next, we have Counselor Janey.
Thank you. Can you hear me? You can hear me okay? Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the dual language expansion. You know, I think it is the most promising of all of the EL programs. Dual language immersion is the most promising. I'd like to understand more the plans for the Cape Verdean program, as someone with a large population of Cape Verdean residents in my district as well. And so one, is it a class? I think I just heard you refer to it as a class superintendent, or is it going to grow from K through 12? And then are there other plans for other languages? I also have Somali in my district, would be interested on that. And then I wanted to offer clarification just around the inclusion piece. So for me, the two-teacher inclusion model is the model we should be moving toward, that Henderson O'Hearn model. And that model, in my mind, is not in conflict with honoring IEPs or individualized learning. I understand that there are cost implications for this model, and so I would, be interested in understanding what they are. I know it's not an increase in this FY21 budget, but if we are thinking that this is the direction we want to go, at some point we would have to plan for that and phase that in. So I'd be interested in what the cost would be if we phased in over time. And I really want us to get away from dumping into general ed and calling it inclusion when we have overworked teachers who may have a triple certification, and then we just dump the kids in there and we hope for the best. And this teacher may or may not have the para, as Counselor Sabi George has already pointed out. And so I don't know how we can close the opportunity and achievement gap. I don't know how we can close an achievement gap if we're not giving students with disabilities the opportunity to learn with a general ed and special education teacher, and just moving away from the triple cert as a strategy for SPED and ELL. Like, I think we have to move away. Now, I understand that we may not do away with it altogether, but, for inclusion to be true inclusion, which I think we all believe in the least, restrictive settings for our young people, and that is the model that we want to go to. But I'd be interested in, if we are going to go to a two-teacher model, one, what do people think about it? And then what are the cost implications over time? And then on some of the other special education programs, like the sub-separate and the out-of-placement district, I think it is really important to peel back and look at some of those charts that were shared earlier, and look at the breakdown of race and gender, and have maybe even a follow-up to this conversation. I don't know, maybe another working session. Maybe it's not related to the budget, but certainly more needs to be done in that area. Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, Superintendent, and to all the members of your team.
Great, thank you
You're
so
welcome.
Yeah,
I do want to just for the record, we do have a standing hearing order that we could use for a future hearing. Sorry, Superintendent.
That's okay, great. Thank you. I'll just be brief in my comments. One is that on the dual language, we are basing our work on the good work we did with our Haitian Creole program, engagement with the community to develop those programs. I know our team has been working with the Cape Verdean community as well. And so they're working on that dual language program. And yes, that would be a progressive program. But in the meantime, they're also developing ethnic studies courses at the high school level. And their plan is to have those in multiple cultural backgrounds and languages. So those are in our academic office. And then with the inclusion, we see the value in all students in inclusion. So both general ed students and special ed students all bring value to that classroom to make it a beautiful mix of diversity within the school community. And so as we think about those programs, we think about the staffing that's necessary. And I do think at sometimes that it is necessary to have a Henderson level of staffing where there are 2 staff there, especially when you have complex student needs. But when you have students who are in the room and they're able to have a one-to-one, for instance, in a para, they're actually, the school functions well. The Manning is a great example of a school where they're able to do it within their current staffing, and they have a beautiful, wonderful program, and they don't have 2 teachers necessarily for every single classroom. So I think that the way that I was hoping to be able to build it and work with the BTU was to really think more about what the students' individual needs are, and then build the classroom to what the students that are assigned to that classrooms, what their needs are, and let the IEP team decisions make that. So that's my vision of what inclusion looks like, and then appropriately staffing those school classrooms. I don't think there's one size that fits all.
I would agree with that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you to both of you. Councilor Arroyo, and then Councilor Flynn, then Councilor Braden.
Thank you. Just mindful of time, one of my things that I really focus on is trauma. And with COVID-19, a lot of our children are facing more trauma than they usually do. They're losing family, they're cooped up, there's a lot of fear. And so one of the questions that I have as it applies to this is, what are we doing right now throughout the pandemic and the remote aspect of education to address trauma that our kids are having and identifying it and finding ways to really work with them, especially considering if that trauma is family-based, it's very difficult to necessarily breach those subjects while they're in their home. So what things are we offering? What things can I offer folks when they call with these kinds of issues? And then moving forward, I'm a big believer that the emotional state of our children is a big part of their learning. And so when we're talking about folks who have English as a second language or folks who have IEPs or even in our general studies, other than the social workers that we have in, what specific resources are available in this budget for dealing with and working for trauma? And if it's not there, if there's money missing there, ideally, what would you like to see us try to find a way to allocate or work towards to deal with that specific subject of trauma with our children?
So, Superintendent, if you could just be quick, because we are hitting up against public testimony in the following hearing. Thank you.
Yep. There's a couple of things. One, we have a helpline for parents, and you can also go online and find the helpline. We also did the survey for parents, and we have almost nearly 50% of our parents who responded to that survey. So our school leaders are working one-to-one with their school staffs to provide the kind of supports that the parents are asking for. And then they have the equity roundtables, and teachers are connecting with their families every 3 days during the COVID in order to see if they need anything. And then just finally, I would say we have a really strong team with Andrea Amador and the coordinated behavioral health, mental health team, and they are working with us on the hub school model to really push that out and to support and staff that appropriately.
Thank you very much again to both of you. Councillor Flynn, then we'll be wrapping up with Councillor Braden. Councillor Flynn? Very good. If he shows up, we'll come back to him. Councillor Braden? Councilor Brady, you're still muted.
Are you hear me now? Good.
Yes.
A quick question about at the Edison, we have a program where we have children with students with emotional disabilities who need a lot of physical intervention and just to keep them safe. They've done some intensive work that seems to be paying dividends, and many of those students have been able to return to a mainstream classroom. Is that a program that, I think it was a pilot program, is that something that's been replicated across the district as needed, and what sort of resources are being given to it?
So we have the counseling and strand support services that are offered to students who are in a substantially separate program. Those resources continue as students move into inclusion. So the types of counseling wraparound supports that students with emotional impairment disabilities might need when they're in a substantially separate program, they may still need those counseling supports when they move into inclusive settings, and those supports are still provided as a part of the resources we allocate beyond the core school budget as they move into an inclusive setting.
And also in terms of ABA support and other accommodations, are those also in place to help?
So ABA support is in place depending upon the student's IEP. So if it requires the IEP, then the services are provided. And then we have the BCBA, the sort of higher level trained staff who provide oversight and support to the ABAs and also help teachers understand how to implement ABA type services directly in their classroom.
And do you have a formalized training for staff in conflict resolution and just ways to de-escalate situations where students are going towards becoming violent?
I know special ed has a pretty wide range of professional development around students with disabilities. If it's a question not about students with disabilities and de-escalation, but with other sorts of professional development, I know that lives within Sanity and the Code of Conduct.
I certainly have counselor my team and Cindy Nielsen, who's terrific at in our special ed department, speak with you offline about it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We're have not enough time to really go into what's happening over at Edison.
Very good, thank you. Also, one of my things is adequate funding to help support our adult ed for our families with who English is not their first language and not proficient in. ESOL classes are really helpful to. I think the knock-on effect will have the impacts on the student outcomes as well as making the adults be more economically successful. So I would like to shout out for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Braden, for that. Councilor Flynn, I don't see has joined us again. So I think that this is perfect because it's 4:35 and we've got to get to those videos from public testimony. So I think that, Carrie, are you there? You'll be taking over for publishing or posting those videos?
Yep, I got it.
Thank you very much. Superintendent, thank you. Nate, David, thank you. And the rest of your team. Counselors, thank you for bearing with Counselor Bach and myself as we're trying to cut it close up to that 5 o'clock hearing that's about to start after these videos.
Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Cecil Carey. I'm a BPS educator and JP resident. I read the DESE findings on inclusion in BPS. Greetings. My name is Cecil Carey. I'm a BPS educator and JP resident. I read the DESE findings on inclusion in BPS and wanted to highlight their recommendation to identify preferred models of inclusive education and include specifics about staffing and credentialing. I strongly believe, based on my experience in the classroom, that the co-teaching model is necessary for truly inclusive education. In my previous role at ACC, a Hyde Park BPS school, I taught Inclusion US History 2 with no support. That means that all classroom teachers had an additional moderate disabilities license. At first, I was excited at the opportunity to teach inclusion, but my excitement quickly faded into anxiety and shame. I found it impossible to support the needs of my students with IEPs as the only adult. How could I sit and read aloud the text to Jimmy while supporting the other 22 students in my class? How could I type Alia's essay as she dictated it to me while other students were asking for help? Quickly, I became ashamed at my inability to implement my students' IEP-mandated accommodations. I cried for my inclusion students, who were physically in the classroom but not included in the learning experience. This contrasts strongly with my experience in my new role at Charlestown High. At CHS, I have a qualified inclusion specialist who supports my Inclusion US History 1 class. I cannot overemphasize the impact she makes. For example, as I teach the whole class, she can pull a group of students for a read aloud, or take notes for students who need scribing. Outside of class time, she helps me modify and provide additional scaffolds. The difference is truly night and day. But this model is too rare in BPS. Co-teaching is the model we need if we are going to serve all students and improve student learning. 2 licenses is not 2 teachers. A co-teaching model would require substantial investment in staffing, training, and scheduling. I strongly urge the Council to support the funding for a co-teaching model across BPS.
Hi, good night, one and all. My name is Tamika Anglin, a resident of Dorchester and the mother of 2 beautiful daughters. One daughter, a graduate of BPS, and my current daughter is a 7th grader in BPS. My youngest daughter has Down syndrome. I have fought for her to be in an inclusive classroom and school since she has been a part of BPS in kindergarten. I know that inclusion is the best educational experience for my daughter. I want her to grow academically and socially with her peers, with or without disabilities. She has grown tremendously in inclusion, and there are many concerns I continue to have, not because of inclusion, but because inclusion is not done right consistently for my daughter. I have to fight to make sure she has enough specialized support to provide her access to the 7th grade curriculum. I believe that her teachers are always working hard to support her. They can't do better without more. There have been too many teachers who have been both her general education and her special education teacher. This isn't no way right. One teacher can't do the job of 2. They can't provide a more meaningful educational experience without additional adult support. I have had to get consultants and lawyers and advocates to help me fight for the right supports for my child's that my child deserves. Parents shouldn't have to fight to have their children receive the education that they truly deserve. I hope Boston Public Schools, with the support of the City of Boston, provides the financial support and the special educational leadership needed to make inclusion work for all kids in this district. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Anna Shapiro, and I'm a ninth grade engineering teacher at Charlestown High School. While all of my classes have students with and without special education needs, each semester one of my classes is officially designated an inclusion class, meaning there is a larger number of students in need of special education services, as well as typically students with greater needs for special education support. Example of this includes students with specific learning disabilities, some of whom are reading decently behind grade level, coming from smaller, substantially separate settings in middle school, often a 6 to 10 person class, to then enter a 20-person inclusion class in high school. Charlestown has a clear vision of what inclusion done right should look like. Our vision includes 2 teachers, with 1 teacher developing content lessons and 1 teacher focusing on modifying those lessons and paying specific attention to the needs of the special education students in the classroom. Both students should meet together regularly to discuss everyone's progress and intervene if students aren't making the progress they should be. This is a great structure, and I think it's particularly important for students as they transition from middle to high school, and especially those changing their type of class size and setting. Unfortunately, while our school really believes in the structure, we don't have the staffing to consistently make it happen. When there aren't 2 teachers available for an inclusion class, a paraprofessional is placed in the role instead of a second teacher. Since my class has changed by the semester, I've had the opportunity to teach my inclusion class both with a para one semester and with a second certified special education teacher the other semester. Our school has many strong paraprofessionals, but they are not given extensive training on inclusion, nor do they have time in their schedules to meet with teachers or modify lessons. That's outside of their job description. This past semester, the students in my inclusion class had 2 teachers. In class, having a second teacher allowed us to do small groups more effectively, provide necessary read-alouds, clarifications, and instructional supports. Outside of class, my co-teacher and I had time to meet to discuss our students' learning needs, create strategies, and ensure student success. The special education students in my inclusion classroom were more successful with the 2-teacher model. I love teaching inclusion classes, and I believe including everyone helps all students learn. Please help our district do what we know is best by supporting funding for inclusion done right at all BPS schools.
My name is Bianca Pierre, and I work as a paraprofessional at the Madarat Elementary School in Madapen. I have worked in both inclusion and general education classrooms. I strongly believe that inclusion is good for all children, provided there is enough staff to meet their needs. When there isn't enough staff, inclusion does not work for anyone. 1 teacher with the support of 1 paraprofessional is not sufficient staffing for inclusion done right. There needs to be more than 1 teacher in an inclusion classroom, and the paraprofessional needs to have training in order to be effective. Paraprofessionals in inclusion classrooms need to have professional development in the best practices for meeting the needs of our inclusion students. And we need training in how to support students with trauma. We should have this professional development before we begin in an inclusion classroom, and we deserve ongoing opportunities to further build our skills. There also needs to be time during the week for us to meet with the teacher or teachers we are working with. That way, we can contribute much more to the children we are serving. We should have inclusion for every child in Boston Public Schools, and it has to be high quality inclusion so that every child has the chance to thrive. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ernestine Noel, and I'm an educator for Boston Public Schools. I believe in inclusion done right. Inclusion done right is when our students with IEPs or special needs are able to get an education in a setting that is least restrictive, with the appropriate staffing models. Today, I want to share a quick story about my journey as an inclusion teacher. I work at a K-8 school where the staffing model is 2 teachers in each classroom, grades 1 through 8. But I am a kindergarten teacher. So our classroom staffing model is quite different. We have a para and a teacher. So I am both the general ed teacher as well as the special ed teacher. But as you can see, I'm just one person. This year, my students were lucky enough to have an extra part-time teacher added to our classroom from September to January. This teacher and I were able to work together, and the gains that our special ed students made this year surpassed those of my 8 years of teaching at the same school and in the same classroom. For example, In past year, my students with IEPs would not have mastered their letters until April or May. But this year, all of my students on IEPs all demonstrated mastery of their letters, both sound and printing and identification, by January. Until this moment, I did not understand the impact that having 2 teachers in a classroom could make. It is a shame that some of our students in our district have access to this, but other inclusion schools do not. My ask is that we have a consistent staffing model, 2 teachers in each classroom in all of our inclusion schools.
My name is Rose Frank, and this is my 6th year teaching in a full inclusion classroom in Boston. I currently teach 3rd grade at the Lee Academy, but I've taught 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, always with a 1 teacher and 1 paraprofessional inclusion model. This year I'm responsible for all 19 of my students, as well as the 4,800 combined weekly minutes, that's 80 hours, of various reading, writing, math, and social emotional IEP goal minutes. This is impossible for me to meet. The number of hours in a school week is only 35 hours. It just doesn't add up. While I am fortunate enough to have a very strong paraprofessional this year, it still feels like an impossible task to meet everyone's needs. One way this year that I have been able to meet students' needs is in writing class. This year in writing, I've been fortunate enough to have the literacy coach push in to co-teach my writing class. In this setup, she becomes the general educator, and I finally get to focus on my inclusion students and work on their goals. With her help to do writing conferences, with my other students, I'm able to meet with a small group of students, and it can look different on different days. I've been helping 3 of my students this year use a word prediction tool to help them with their writing. Another one of my students has an IEP goal to focus on hearing the sounds in words to help him with his spelling. I can draw letter sound boxes to help him slow down and really work on the skill of hearing the sounds. And if my student with autism happens to be having a difficult moment and needs some behavior coaching, myself or my paraprofessional is there to help him without sacrificing the learning of the other 18 students in the room. This model, having 2 licensed teachers and a paraprofessional in the room, has allowed my students to grow tremendously in writing this year. Unfortunately, that's not the whole school day, and that's not a guarantee for next year. We want inclusion done right, and we need your support to fight for the funding for the appropriate staffing for our most vulnerable students.
Hi, my name is Mark Knapp, and this is my 20th year teaching at Josiah Quincy Upper School as a science and special needs high school teacher. JQUS is an IB for all school that offers an international baccalaureate education to all students, regardless of their social, emotional, and academic levels. This year, one of my classes is an inclusion 9th grade IB middle years program biology class. Although as a school, our principals and teachers understand what a properly functioning inclusion classroom should look like, we struggle to make it a reality. By the way, this is something most BPS inclusion classrooms probably struggle with. I believe there are a couple of important gaps in what we know students in an inclusion classroom need and what we're able to provide. For example, not all inclusion classrooms have a staff ratio that provides sufficient one-on-one attention struggling students need. Simply put, these classrooms require funding for a higher staff-to-student ratio. Another obvious deficiency is our pursuit of a successful inclusion classroom model is the lack of common planning time required to scaffold lessons that provide individualized instruction for all students. The staff in the classroom may have all the experience in the world, but when they don't get sufficient time to share and reflect on lessons, they end up walking into the classroom to just put out fires and address only the most immediate needs of students. Still, there are many reasons inclusion classrooms should be the model we follow in BPS. Most important, I feel they provide opportunities for students of all levels to build social, emotional, and leadership skills and learn from one another what makes us all uniquely wonderful. I ask you please consider supporting funding for resources and staff to make inclusion successful in BPS. Thank you very much, and please stay safe and healthy during these difficult times.
Desiree Bond. I am currently a 4th grade inclusion teacher at the Blackstone Elementary School. I previously taught for 3 years at the Mather School and 1 year in Virginia. I am a strong believer in the benefits of inclusion. I know that students with and without disabilities have a lot to learn from each other. I've seen students with varied abilities learning from each other by showing support, giving feedback, and strengthening our classroom community and discussion opportunities. This is fascinating to experience and empowers all those involved, teachers and students alike. However, I also know that as one teacher, I am not able to provide my students with the consistent, high-quality instruction they deserve. Like in all inclusion classrooms, my students have individualized education programs that require a lot of small group and one-to-one instruction. For example, while most of my students are working on larger multiplication and division problems, I have one student with an IEP goal of mastering basic multiplication facts, and another student whose goal is focused on mastering addition up to 20. Both students need intensive math support before successfully accessing grade-level content. However, in our inclusion model, I am the only teacher to provide this support. No matter how hard I work, and I give my heart and soul to my students every day, I continually feel like I'm shortchanging either my general education students or my students with very significant special needs. Although I am certified to teach both groups of students, I cannot do 2 jobs at the same time. Now the schools are closed, it is even harder to meet my students' needs. The accommodations that we work so hard to develop in the classroom don't work virtually. Inconsistent internet and interrupted schedules due to family survival needs have also made it difficult to support my students with the greatest needs. City Council Education Chair Asabi George and members of the City Council, we need you to understand the realities of inclusion in the Boston Public Schools. We call on you to commit to inclusion done right. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to turn this time out of school into a better future for our most vulnerable students. We need you to stand with us to fight for the funds that are required to provide a first-class education to every student in BPS. We are counting on you to help us realize this vision. Thank you.
I think that might be the end of the public testimony. I am going to I'm not handling much, but I will hand the gavel back.
My name is Caitlin Gaffney, and I've been a teacher at the Maurice J. Tobin K-8 school in Mission Hill for the last 20 years. I would like to begin by thanking the mayor and the superintendent for the continued investment in our schools, which will result in us having 1.5 social workers for the first time I can recall in a school that serves a high trauma, high need population. Sustaining and expanding these types of social emotional supports will enable us to meet the diverse needs of our students in order to more readily access their academic learning. At the Tobin, we have long been a school that called on one teacher to meet vast and complex needs. There have been oversized classes with students who have IEPs in double digits, while our school had to fight to have more than one special educator for an entire K-8. With the specialized instruction, testing, and meetings, that presented extreme challenges, straining our woman power and underserving our learners. What did that say about how we prioritize our most needy children in the system? I know that there are other schools and other zip codes in Boston that did not have those same skeletal resources, and it leaves our most vulnerable families, along with their teachers, asking why. We are grateful that the district has become more responsive. We have benefited from our devoted coaches who have ensured that students receive the services they need, and the special ed department has stepped up to support. When a student's IEP calls for a particular program or service, we should offer it. When a teacher needs training in a rules-based reading program, they should be able to get it. When students benefit from a different setting, their families shouldn't have to wait months for it. When classrooms need more than one educator to meet all of the identified needs, we shouldn't have to beg for it. I come before you today to ask that you speak to parents, children, and families to understand what the issues are. We invite you to spend the day in our schools, as Councillor Bach did some months back at the Tobin. I ask you to commit to advocating for our most vulnerable students to fix the gaping holes that we have all known existed for years. Lastly, I ask you to approve additional funding. I am hopeful that with continued collaboration between us, we will be able to provide a more well-rounded, more student-centered learning model. Thank you so much. Stay well.
Thank you. I have come back and taken up the baton, and that was Caitlin is a teacher at the Tobin, which, as we've mentioned, is in my district. I'm grateful to everybody who testified today, both in person and on video, and just want to, again, before we adjourn, thank the administration for what's been a long day, focused on a bunch of the most critical issues that I think, are appropriately included in the very first commitment of the strategic plan. So Dr. Caselius, thank you so much.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and all of the counselors for all your considerations and thoughtful questions. And I especially want to thank the teachers who were here today testifying about their students and the needs of their students. It just shows their incredible commitment. And on this Teacher Appreciation Day, I know Nate opened, and I'm going to close just to say thank you to all our wonderful, great teachers out there.
Thank you. Yes.
And paraprofessionals.
Yes, important to include. And I know the council and Councillor Flynn, who I see is still here, and myself would definitely join you in that appreciation of all our teachers today and every day. So with that, I am adjourning this meeting of the Boston City Council's Committee on Ways and Means. Thank you all.